Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Prologue. Once when I was in 9th grade, I had to write a paper on a poem. One of the lines was, "If your eyes weren't open, you wouldn't know the difference between dreaming and waking." It hadn't meant much to me at the time. After all, there'd been a guy in the class that I liked, so how could I be expected to pay attention to literary analysis? Now, 3 years later, I understood the poem perfectly. Because lately, my life really did seem like it was on the precipice of being a dream. There were days I thought I'd wake up and discover that recent events in my life hadn't actually happened. Surely I must be a princess in an enchanted sleep. Any day now, this dream, no, nightmare would end, and I'd get my prince and happy ending. But there was no happy ending to be found, at least not in the foreseeable future. And my prince? Well, that was a long story. My prince had been turned into a vampire, a strigoi, to be specific. In my world, there are two kinds of vampires who exist in secrecy from humans. The Moroi are living vampires, good vampires who wield elemental magic and don't kill when seeking the blood they need to survive. Strigoi are undead vampires, immortal and twisted, who kill when they feed. Moroi are born. Strigoi are made forcibly or by choice through evil means. And Dimitri, the guy I loved, had been made a strigoi against his will. He'd been turned during a battle, an epic rescue mission that I'd been part of as well. Strigoi had kidnapped Moroi and Dompiers from the school I attended, and we'd set out with others to save them. Dompiers are half vampire and half human, gifted with human strength and hardiness, and Moroi reflexes and senses. Dompiers train to become guardians, the elite bodyguards who protect Moroi. That's what I am. That's what Dimitri had been. After his conversion, the rest of the Moroi world had considered him dead. And to a certain extent, he was. Those who were turned strigoi lost all sense of the goodness and life they'd had before. Even if they hadn't turned by choice, it didn't matter. They would still become evil and cruel, just like all strigoi. The person they'd been was gone, and honestly, it was easier to imagine them moving on to heaven or the next life than to picture them out stalking the night and taking victims. But I hadn't been able to forget Dimitri, or accept that he was essentially dead. He was the man I loved, the man with whom I'd been so perfectly in sync that it was hard to know where I ended and he began. My heart refused to let him go. Even if he was technically a monster, he was still out there somewhere. I also hadn't forgotten a conversation he and I had once had. We'd both agreed that we'd rather be dead, truly dead, than walk the world as strigoi. And once I'd had my mourning time for the goodness he'd lost, I'd decided I had to honor his wishes. Even if he no longer believed in them. I had to find him. I had to kill him and free his soul from that dark, unnatural state. I knew it was what the Dimitri I had loved would have wanted. Killing strigoi isn't easy, though. They're insanely fast and strong. They have no mercy. I'd killed a number of them already, pretty crazy for someone who was freshly 18. And I knew taking on Dimitri would be my greatest challenge, both physically and emotionally. In fact, the emotional consequences had kicked in as soon as I made my decision. Going after Dimitri had meant doing a few life-altering things, and that wasn't even counting the fact that fighting him could very likely result in the loss of my life. I was still in school, only a handful of months away from graduating and becoming a full-fledged guardian. Every day I stuck around at St. Vladimir's Academy, a remote, protected school for Moroi and Dompiers, meant one more day was going by in which Dimitri was still out there, living in the state he'd never wanted. I loved him too much to allow that. So I'd had to leave school early and go out among humans, abandoning the world I'd lived in nearly my entire life. Leaving had also meant abandoning one other thing, or rather, a person, my best friend, Lisa, also known as Vasilisa Dragomir. Lisa was Moroi, the last in a royal line. I'd been slated to be her guardian when we graduated, and my decision to hunt Dimitri had pretty much destroyed that future with her. I'd had no choice but to leave her. Aside from our friendship, Lissa and I had a unique connection. Each Maroi specializes in a type of elemental magic: earth, air, water, or fire. Until recently, we believed there were only those four elements. Then we discovered a fifth: spirit. That was Lissa's element, and with so few spirit users in the world, we hardly knew anything about it. For the most part, it seemed to be tied to psychic powers. Lissa wielded amazing compulsion, the ability to exert her will on almost anyone. She could also heal, and that's where things got a little strange between us. You see, I technically died in the car accident that killed her family. Lissa had brought me back from the world of the dead without realizing it, creating a psychic bond between us. Ever since then, I was always aware of her presence and thoughts. I could tell what she was thinking and feel when she was in trouble. We had also recently discovered I could see ghosts and spirits who hadn't yet left this world, something I found disconcerting and struggled to block out. The whole phenomenon was called being shadow-kissed. Our shadow-kissed bond made me the ideal choice to protect Lissa, since I would instantly know if she was in trouble. I'd promised to protect her my whole life, but then Dimitri, tall, gorgeous, fierce Dimitri, had changed it all. I'd been faced with that horrible choice: continue to protect Lissa or free Dimitri's soul. Choosing between them had broken my heart, leaving an ache in my chest and tears in my eyes. My parting with Lissa had been agonizing. We'd been best friends since kindergarten, and my departure was a shock for both of us. To be fair, she'd never seen it coming. I'd kept my romance with Dimitri a secret. He was my instructor, 7 years older than me, and had been assigned to be her guardian as well. As such, he and I had tried hard to fight our attraction, knowing we had to focus on Lissa more than anything else, and that we'd also get in a fair amount of trouble for our student-teacher relationship. But being kept from Dimitri, even though I'd agreed to it, had caused me to build up a lot of unspoken resentment toward Lissa. I probably should have talked to her about it and explained my frustration over having my entire life planned out. It didn't seem fair, somehow, that while Lissa was free to live and love however she wanted, I would always have to sacrifice my own happiness to ensure that she was protected. She was my best friend, though, and I couldn't bear the thought of upsetting her. Lissa was particularly vulnerable because using spirit had the nasty side effect of driving people insane. So I'd sat on my feelings until they finally exploded, and I left the academy and her behind for good. One of the ghosts I'd seen, Mason, a friend who had been killed by strigoi, had told me Dimitri had returned to his homeland, Siberia. Mason's soul had found peace and left this world shortly thereafter, without giving me any other clues about where in Siberia Dimitri might have gone. So I'd had to set out there blindly, braving a world of humans and a language I didn't know in order to fulfill the promise I'd made to myself. After a few weeks on my own, I had finally made it to St. Petersburg. I was still looking, still floundering, but determined to find him, even though I dreaded it at the same time. Because if I really did pull this insane plan off, if I actually managed to kill the man I loved, it would mean Dimitri would truly be gone from the world. And I honestly wasn't sure I could go on in a world like that. None of it seems real. Who knows? Maybe it isn't. Maybe it's actually happening to someone else. Maybe it's something I imagined. Maybe soon I'm going to wake up and find everything fixed with Lissa and Dimitri. We'll all be together, and he'll be there to smile and hold me and tell me everything's going to be okay. Maybe all of this really has been a dream. But I don't think so. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 1. I was being followed. It was kind of ironic, considering the way I'd been following others for the last few weeks. At least it wasn't a strigoi. I would have already known. A recent effect of my being shadow-kissed was the ability to sense the undead through bouts of nausea, unfortunately. Still, I appreciated my body's early warning system and was relieved my stalker tonight wasn't an insanely fast, insanely vicious vampire. I'd fought enough of those recently and kind of wanted a night off. I had to guess my follower was a domper like me, probably one from the club. Admittedly, this person was moving a little less stealthily than I would have expected of a domper. Footsteps were clearly audible against the pavement of the dark side streets I was traveling on, and once, I'd caught a brief glimpse of a shadowy figure. Still, considering my rash actions tonight, a domper was the most likely culprit. It had all started earlier at the Nightingale. That wasn't the club's true name, only a translation. Its real name was something Russian that was beyond my ability to pronounce. Back in the US, the Nightingale was well known among rich Maroi who traveled abroad, and now I could understand why. No matter what time of the day it was, people at the Nightingale dressed like they were at an imperial ball. And, well, the whole place actually kind of looked like something from the old, royal days of Russia, with ivory walls covered in gold scrollwork and molding. It reminded me a lot of the Winter Palace, a royal residence left over from when Russia had still been ruled by czars. I toured it upon first arriving in St. Petersburg. At the Nightingale, elaborate chandeliers filled with real candles glittered in the air, lighting up the gold decor so that even in dim lighting, the whole establishment sparkled. There was a large dining room filled with velvet draped tables and booths, as well as a lounge and bar area where people could mingle. Late in the evening, a band would set up in there, and couples would hit the dance floor. I hadn't bothered with the Nightingale when I arrived in the city a couple weeks ago. I'd been arrogant enough to think I could find Maroi right away who could direct me to Dimitri's hometown in Siberia. With no other clues about where Dimitri had gone in Siberia, heading to the town he'd grown up in had been my best chance of getting closer to him. Only, I didn't know where it was, which was why I was trying to find Maroi to help me. There were a number of domper towns and communes in Russia but hardly any in Siberia, which made me believe most local Maroi would be familiar with his birthplace. Unfortunately, it turned out that the Maroi who lived in human cities were very good at keeping themselves hidden. I checked what I thought were likely Maroi hangouts, only to come up empty. And without those Maroi, I had no answers. So, I'd begun staking out the Nightingale, which wasn't easy. It was hard for an 18-year-old girl to blend into one of the city's most elite clubs. I'd soon found that expensive clothes and large enough tips went a long way toward helping me get by. The waitstaff had come to know me, and if they thought my presence was strange, they didn't say so and were happy to give me the corner table I always asked for. I think they thought I was the daughter of some tycoon or politician. Whatever my background, I had the money to be there, which was all they cared about. Even so, my first few nights there had been discouraging. The Nightingale might have been an elite hangout for Maroi, but it was also frequented by humans. And at first, it had seemed those were the club's only patrons. Crowds grew larger as the night progressed, and in peering through the packed tables and people lingering at the bar, I'd seen no Maroi. The most notable thing I'd seen was a woman with long, platinum blonde hair walking into the lounge with a group of friends. For a moment, my heart had stopped. The woman had her back to me, but she had looked so much like Lisa that I'd felt certain I'd been tracked down. The weird thing was, I didn't know whether to feel excited or horrified. I missed Lisa so much, yet at the same time, I didn't want her involved in this dangerous trip of mine. Then the woman had turned around. It wasn't Lisa. She wasn't even a Maroi, just a human. Slowly, my breathing returned to normal. Finally, a week or so ago, I'd had my first sighting. A group of Maroi women had come in for a late lunch, accompanied by two guardians, one male and one female, who sat dutifully and quietly at the table as their charges gossiped and laughed over afternoon champagne. Dodging those guardians had been the trickiest part. For those who knew what to look for, Maroi were easy to spot, taller than most humans, pale, and uber slim. They also had a certain funny way of smiling and holding their lips in order to hide their fangs. Dompiers, with our human blood, appeared, well, human. That was certainly how I looked to the untrained human eye. I was about 5'7", and whereas Maroi tended to have unreal, runway model bodies, mine was athletically built and curvy in the chest. Genetics from my unknown Turkish father and too much time in the sun had given me a light tan that paired well with long, nearly black hair and equally dark eyes. But those who had been raised in the Maroi world could spot me as a Domper through close examination. I'm not sure what it was, maybe some instinct that drew us to our own kind and recognized the mix of Maroi blood. Regardless, it was imperative that I appear human to those guardians, so I didn't raise their alarms. I sat across the room in my corner, picking over caviar and pretending to read my book. For the record, I thought caviar was disgusting, but it seemed to be everywhere in Russia, particularly in the nice places. That and borscht, a kind of beet soup. I almost never finished my food at the Nightingale and would ravenously hit McDonald's afterward, even though the Russian McDonald's restaurants were a bit different from what I'd grown up with in the US. Still, a girl had to eat. So it became a test of my skill, studying the Maroi when their guardians weren't watching. Admittedly, the guardians had little to fear during the day, since there would be no strigoi out in the sun. But it was in guardian nature to watch everything, and their eyes continually swept the room. I'd had the same training and knew their tricks, so I managed to spy without detection. The women came back a lot, usually late in the afternoon. Saint Vladimir's ran on a nocturnal schedule, but Maroi and Dompirs living out among humans either ran on a daylight schedule or something in between. For a while, I'd considered approaching them or even their guardians. Something held me back. If anyone would know where a town of Dompirs lived, it would be male Maroi. Many of them visited Domper towns in hopes of scoring easy Domper girls. So I promised myself I'd wait another week to see if any guys came by. If not, I would see what kind of information the women could give me. At last, a couple days ago, 2 Maroi guys had started showing up. They tended to come later in the evening, when the real partiers arrived. The men were about 10 years older than me and strikingly handsome, wearing designer suits and silk ties. They carried themselves like powerful, important people, and I would have bet good money that they were royal, particularly since each one came with a guardian. The guardians were always the same, young men who wore suits to blend in but still carefully watched the room with that clever guardian nature. And there were women, always women. The 2 Maroi were terrible flirts, continually scoping out and hitting on every woman in sight, even humans. But they never went home with any humans. That was a taboo still firmly ingrained in our world. Maroi had kept themselves separate from humans for centuries, fearing detection from a race that had grown so plentiful and powerful. Still, that didn't mean the men went home alone. At some point in the evening, Domper women usually showed up, different ones every night. They'd come in wearing low-cut dresses and lots of makeup, drinking heavily and laughing at everything the guys said, which probably wasn't even that funny. The women always wore their hair down, but every once in a while, they'd shift their heads in a way that showed their necks, which were heavily bruised. They were blood whores, Dompirs who let Maroi drink blood during sex. That was also a taboo, though it still happened in secret. I kept wanting to get one of the Maroi men alone, away from the watchful eyes of his guardian so that I could question him. But it was impossible. The guardians never left their Maroi unattended. I even attempted to follow them, but each time the group left the club, they'd almost immediately hop into a limousine, making it impossible for me to track them on foot. It was frustrating. I finally decided tonight that I'd have to approach the whole group and risk detection by the Dompirs. I didn't know if anyone from back home was actually looking for me, or if the group would even care who I was. Maybe I just had too high an opinion of myself. It was definitely possible that no one was actually concerned about a runaway dropout. But if anyone was looking for me, my description had undoubtedly been circulated amongst guardians worldwide. Even though I was now 18, I wouldn't have put it past some of the people I knew to haul me back to the US, and there was no way I could return until I'd found Dimitri. Then, just as I was considering my move on the group of Maroi, one of the Domper women left the table to walk up to the bar. The guardians watched her, of course, but seemed confident about her safety and were more fixated on the Maroi. All this time, I'd been thinking Maroi men would be the best way to go to get information about a village of Dompirs and blood whores, but what better way to locate this place than by asking an actual blood whore? I strolled casually from my table and approached the bar, like I too was going to get a drink. I stood by as the woman waited for the bartender and studied her in my periphery. She was blonde and wore a long dress covered in silver sequins. I couldn't decide if it made my black satin sheath dress appear tasteful or boring. All of her movements, even the way she stood, were graceful, like a dancer's. The bartender was helping others, and I knew it was now or never. I leaned toward her. "Do you speak English?" She jumped in surprise and looked over at me. She was older than I'd expected, her age cleverly concealed by makeup. Her blue eyes assessed me quickly, recognizing me as a Domper. "Yes," she said warily. Even the one word carried a thick accent. "I'm looking for a town where lots of Dompirs live, out in Siberia. Do you know what I'm talking about? I need to find it." Again she studied me, and I couldn't read her expression. She might as well have been a guardian for all that her face revealed. Maybe she'd trained at one time in her life. "Don't," she said bluntly. "Let it go." She turned away, her gaze back on the bartender as he made someone a blue cocktail adorned with cherries. I touched her arm. "I have to find it. There's a man." I choked on the word. So much for my cool interrogation. Just thinking about Dimitri made my heart stick in my throat. How could I even explain it to this woman? That I was following a long-shot clue, seeking out the man I loved most in the world, a man who had been turned into a strigoi and who I now needed to kill? Even now, I could perfectly picture the warmth of his brown eyes and the way his hands used to touch me. How could I do what I had crossed an ocean to do? "Focus, Rose. Focus." The Domper woman looked back at me. "He's not worth it," she said, mistaking my meaning. No doubt she thought I was a lovesick girl, chasing some boyfriend, which, I supposed, I kind of was. "You're too young, it's not too late for you to avoid all that." Her face might have been impassive, but there was sadness in her voice. "Go do something else with your life. Stay away from that place. You know where it is." I exclaimed, too worked up to explain that I wasn't going there to be a blood whore. "Please, you have to tell me. I have to get there. Is there a problem?" Both she and I turned and looked into the fierce face of one of the guardians. Damn. The Domper woman might not be their top priority, but they would have noticed someone harassing her. The guardian was only a little older than me, and I gave him a sweet smile. I might not be spilling out of my dress like this other woman, but I knew my short skirt did great things for my legs. Surely even a guardian wasn't immune to that. Well, apparently he was. His hard expression showed that my charms weren't working. Still, I figured I might as well try my luck with him on getting intel. "I'm trying to find a town in Siberia, a town where Dompirs live. Do you know it?" He didn't blink. "No." "Wonderful." Both were playing difficult. "Yeah, well, maybe your boss does." I asked demurely, hoping I sounded like an aspiring blood whore. If the Dompirs wouldn't talk, maybe one of the Maroi would. Maybe he wants some company and would talk to me. "He already has company," the guardian replied evenly. "He doesn't need any more." I kept the smile on. "Are you sure?" I purred. "Maybe we should ask him." "No," replied the guardian. In that one word, I heard the challenge and the command. Back off. He wouldn't hesitate to take on anyone he thought was a threat to his master, even a lowly Domper girl. I considered pushing my case further but quickly decided to follow the warning and indeed back off. I gave an unconcerned shrug. "His loss." And with no other words, I walked casually back to my table, like the rejection was no big deal. All the while I held my breath, half expecting the guardian to drag me out of the club by my hair. It didn't happen. Yet as I gathered my coat and set some cash on the table, I saw him watching me, eyes wary and calculating. I left the Nightingale with that same nonchalant air, heading out toward the busy street. It was a Saturday night, and there were lots of other clubs and restaurants nearby. Partygoers filled the streets, some dressed as richly as the Nightingale's patrons, others were my age and dressed in casual wear. Lines spilled out of the clubs, dance music loud and heavy with bass. Glass-fronted restaurants showed elegant diners and richly set tables. As I walked through the crowds, surrounded by Russian conversation, I resisted the urge to look behind me. I didn't want to raise any further suspicion if that Domper was watching. Yet when I turned down a quiet street that was a shortcut back to my hotel, I could hear the soft sounds of footsteps. I apparently had raised enough alarm that the guardian had decided to follow me. Well, there was no way I was going to let him get the drop on me. I might have been smaller than him and wearing a dress and heels, but I had fought plenty of men, including strigoi. I could handle this guy, especially if I used the element of surprise. After walking this neighborhood for so long, I knew it and its twists and turns well. I picked up my pace and darted around a few corners, one of which led me into a dark, deserted alley. Scary, yeah, but it made for a good ambush spot when I ducked into a doorway. I quietly stepped out of my high-heeled shoes. They were black with pretty leather straps, but not ideal in a fight, unless I planned on gouging someone in the eye with a heel. Actually, not a bad idea. But I wasn't quite that desperate. Without them, the pavement was cold beneath my bare feet since it had rained earlier in the day. I didn't have to wait long. A few moments later, I heard the footsteps and saw my pursuer's long shadow appear on the ground, cast in the flickering light of a street lamp on the adjacent road. My stalker came to a stop, no doubt searching for me. Really, I thought, this guy was careless. No guardian in pursuit would have been so obvious. He should have moved with more stealth and not revealed himself so easily. Maybe the guardian training here in Russia wasn't as good as what I'd grown up with. No, that couldn't be true. Not with the way Dimitri had dispatched his enemies. They'd called him a god at the academy. My pursuer took a few more steps, and that's when I made my move. I leapt out, fists ready. Okay, I exclaimed. I only wanted to ask a few questions, so just back off or else I froze. The guardian from the club wasn't standing there. A human was. A girl, no older than me. She was about my height, with cropped dark blonde hair and a navy blue trench coat that looked expensive. Underneath it, I could see nice dress pants and leather boots that looked as pricey as the coat. More startling still was that I recognized her. I'd seen her twice at the Nightingale, talking to the Maroi men. I'd assumed she was just another of the women they liked to flirt with and had promptly dismissed her. After all, what use was a human to me? Her face was partly covered in shadow, but even in poor lighting, I could make out her annoyed expression. That wasn't quite what I'd expected. "It's you, isn't it?" she asked. Cue more shock. Her English was as American as my own. "You're the one who's been leaving the string of strigoi bodies around the city. I saw you back in the club tonight and knew it had to be you." No other words formed on my lips. I had no idea how to respond. A human talking casually about strigoi. It was unheard of. This was almost more astonishing than actually running into a strigoi out here. I'd never experienced anything like this in my life. She didn't seem to care about my stupefied state. "Look, you can't just do that, okay? Do you know what a pain in the ass it is for me to deal with? This internship is bad enough without you making a mess of it. The police found a body you left in the park, you know. You cannot even imagine how many strings I had to pull to cover that up." Who are you?" I asked at last. It was true. I had left a body in the park, but seriously, what was I supposed to do? Drag him back to my hotel and tell the bellhop my friend had had too much to drink? Sydney, the girl said wearily. My name's Sydney. I'm the alchemist assigned here. The what? She sighed loudly, and I was pretty sure she rolled her eyes. Of course. That explains everything. No, not really, I said, finally regaining my composure. In fact, I think you're the one who has a lot of explaining to do. An attitude too. Are you some kind of test they sent here for me? Oh, man. That's it? I was getting angry now. I didn't like being chastised. I certainly didn't like being chastised by a human who made it sound like me killing strigoi was a bad thing. Look, I don't know who you are or how you know about any of this, but I'm not going to stand here and nausea rolled over me and I tensed, my hand immediately going for the silver stake I kept in my coat pocket. Sydney still wore that annoyed expression, but it was mingled with confusion now at the abrupt change in my posture. She was observant, I'd give her that. What's wrong? She asked. You're going to have another body to deal with, I said, just as the strigoi attacked her. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 2. Going for her instead of me was bad form on the strigoi's part. I was the threat, he should have neutralized me first. Our positioning had put Sydney in his way, however, so he had to dispatch her before he could get to me. He grabbed her shoulder, jerking her to him. He was fast, they always were, but I was on my game tonight. A swift kick knocked him into a neighboring building's wall and freed Sydney from his grasp. He grunted on impact and slumped to the ground, stunned and surprised. It wasn't easy to get the drop on a strigoi, not with their lightning-fast reflexes. Abandoning Sydney, he focused his attention on me, red eyes angry and lips curled back to show his fangs. He sprang up from his fall with that preternatural speed and lunged for me. I dodged him and attempted a punch that he dodged in return. His next blow caught me on the arm, and I stumbled, just barely keeping my balance. My stake was still clutched in my right hand, but I needed an opening to hit his chest. A smart strigoi would have angled himself in a way that ruined the line of sight to his heart. This guy was only doing a so-so job, and if I could stay alive long enough, I'd likely get an opening. Just then, Sydney came up and hit him on the back. It wasn't a very strong blow, but it startled him. It was my opening. I sprinted as hard as I could, throwing my full weight at him. My stake pierced his heart as we slammed against the wall. It was as simple as that. The life or undead life or whatever faded away from him. He stopped moving. I jerked out my stake once I was certain he was dead and watched as his body crumpled to the ground. Just like with every strigoi I'd killed lately, I had a momentary surreal feeling. What if this had been Dimitri? I tried to imagine Dimitri's face on this strigoi, tried to imagine him lying before me. My heart twisted in my chest. For a split second, the image was there. Then gone. This was just some random strigoi. I promptly shook the disorientation off and reminded myself that I had important things to worry about here. I had to check on Sydney. Even with a human, my protective nature couldn't help but kick in. Are you okay? She nodded, looking shaken but otherwise unharmed. Nice work, she said. She sounded as though she were forcibly trying to sound confident. I've never actually seen one of them killed. I couldn't imagine how she would have, but then, I didn't get how she knew about any of this stuff in the first place. She looked like she was in shock, so I took her arm and started to lead her away. Come on, let's get out to where there's more people. Strigoi lurking near the Nightingale wasn't that crazy of an idea, the more I thought about it. What better place to stalk Maroi than at one of their hangouts? Though, hopefully, most guardians would have enough sense to keep their charges out of alleys like this. The suggestion of departure snapped Sydney out of her daze. What? She exclaimed. You're just going to leave him too? I threw up my hands. What do you expect me to do? I guess I can move him behind those trash cans and then let the sun incinerate him. That's what I usually do. Right. And what if someone shows up to take out the trash? Or comes out of one of these back doors? Well, I can hardly drag him off. Or set him on fire. A vampire barbecue would kind of attract some attention, don't you think? Sydney shook her head in exasperation and walked over to the body. She made a face as she looked down at the strigoi and reached into her large leather purse. From it, she produced a small vial. With a deft motion, she sprinkled the vial's contents over the body and then quickly stepped back. Where the drops had hit his corpse, yellow smoke began to curl away. The smoke slowly moved outward, spreading horizontally rather than vertically until it cocooned the strigoi entirely. Then it contracted and contracted until it was nothing but a fist-size ball. In a few seconds, the smoke drifted off entirely, leaving an innocuous pile of dust behind. You're welcome, said Sydney flatly, still giving me a disapproving look. What the hell was that? I exclaimed. My job. Can you please call me the next time this happens? She started to turn away. Wait. I can't call you, I have no idea who you are. She glanced back at me and brushed blonde hair out of her face. Really? You're serious, aren't you? I thought you were all taught about us when you graduated. Oh, well. Funny thing. I kind of, didn't graduate. Sydney's eyes widened. You took down one of those things, but never graduated. I shrugged, and she remained silent for several seconds. Finally, she sighed again and said, I guess we need to talk. Did we ever? Meeting her had to be the strangest thing that had happened to me since coming to Russia. I wanted to know why she thought I should have been in contact with her and how she'd dissolved that strigoi corpse. And, as we returned to the busy streets and walked toward a cafe she liked, it occurred to me that if she knew about the Maroi world, there might be a chance she also knew where Dimitri's village was. Dimitri. There he was again, popping back into my mind. I had no clue if he really would be lurking near his hometown, but I had nothing else to go on at this point. Again, that weird feeling came over me. My mind blurred Dimitri's face with that of the strigoi I'd just killed, pale skin, red-ringed eyes. No, I sternly told myself. Don't focus on that yet. Don't panic. Until I faced Dimitri the strigoi, I would gain the most strength from remembering the Dimitri I loved, with his deep brown eyes, warm hands, fierce embrace. Are you okay, whatever your name is? Sydney was staring at me strangely, and I realized we'd come to a halt in front of a restaurant. I didn't know what look I wore on my face, but it must have been enough to raise even her attention. Until now, my impression as we walked had been that she wanted to speak to me as little as possible. Yeah, fine, I said brusquely, putting on my guardian face. And I'm Rose. Is this the place? It was. The restaurant was bright and cheery, albeit a far cry from the Nightingale's opulence. We slid into a black leather, by which I mean fake plastic leather booth, and I was delighted to see the menu had both American and Russian food. The listings were translated into English, and I nearly drooled when I saw fried chicken. I was starving after not eating at the club, and the thought of deep-fried meat was luxurious after weeks of cabbage dishes and so-called McDonald's. A waitress arrived, and Sydney ordered in fluent Russian, whereas I just pointed at the menu. Huh. Sydney was just full of surprises. Considering her harsh attitude, I expected her to interrogate me right away, but when the waitress left, Sydney remained quiet, simply playing with her napkin and avoiding eye contact. It was so strange. She was definitely uncomfortable around me. Even with the table between us, it was like she couldn't get far enough away. Yet her earlier outrage hadn't been faked, and she'd been adamant about me following whatever these rules of hers were. Well, she might have been playing coy, but I had no such hesitation about busting into uncomfortable topics. In fact, it was kind of my trademark. So, are you ready to tell me who you are and what's going on? Sydney looked up. Now that we were in brighter light, I could see that her eyes were brown. I also noticed that she had an interesting tattoo on her lower left cheek. The ink looked like gold, something I'd never seen before. It was an elaborate design of flowers and leaves and was only really visible when she tilted her head certain ways so that the gold caught the light. I told you, she said. I'm an alchemist. And I told you, I don't know what that is. Is it some Russian word? It didn't sound like one. A half smile played on her lips. No, I take it you've never heard of alchemy either. I shook my head, and she propped her chin up with her hand, eyes staring down at the table again. She swallowed, like she was bracing herself, and then a rush of words came out. Back in the Middle Ages, there were these people who were convinced that if they found the right formula or magic, they could turn lead into gold. Unsurprisingly, they couldn't. This didn't stop them from pursuing all sorts of other mystical and supernatural stuff, and eventually they did find something magical. She frowned. Vampires. I thought back to my Maroi history classes. The Middle Ages were when our kind really started pulling away from humans, hiding out and keeping to ourselves. That was the time when vampires truly became myth as far as the rest of the world was concerned, and even Maroi were regarded as monsters worth hunting. Sydney verified my thoughts. And that was when the Maroi began to stay away. They had their magic, but humans were starting to outnumber them. We still do. That almost brought a smile to her face. Maroi sometimes had trouble conceiving, whereas humans seemed to have too easy a time. And the Maroi made a deal with the alchemists. If the alchemists would help Maroi and Dompiers and their societies stay secret from humans, the Maroi would give us these. She touched the golden tattoo. What is that? I asked. I mean, aside from the obvious. She gently stroked it with her fingertips and didn't bother hiding the sarcasm when she spoke. My guardian angel. It's actually gold, and she grimaced and dropped her hand. Maroi blood, charmed with water and earth. What? My voice came out too loud, and some people in the restaurant turned to look at me. Sydney continued speaking, her tone much lower and very bitter. I'm not thrilled about it, but it's our reward for helping you guys. The water and earth bind it to our skin and give us the same traits Maroi have, well, a couple of them. I almost never get sick. I'll live a long life. I guess that sounds good, I said uncertainly. Maybe for some. We don't have a choice. This career is a family thing, it gets passed down. We all have to learn about Maroi and Dompiers. We work connections among humans that let us cover up for you since we can move around more freely. We've got tricks and techniques to get rid of strigoi bodies like that potion you saw. In return, though, we want to stay apart from you as much as we can, which is why most Dompiers aren't told about us until they graduate. And Maroi hardly ever. She abruptly stopped. I guess the lesson was over. My head was reeling. I had never considered anything like this. Wait. Had I? Most of my education had emphasized the physical aspects of being a guardian, watchfulness, combat, etc. Yet every so often I'd heard vague references to those out in the human world who would help hide Maroi or get them out of weird and dangerous situations. I'd never thought much about it or heard the term alchemist. If I had stayed in school, maybe I would have. This probably wasn't an idea I should have suggested, but my nature couldn't help it. Why keep the charm to yourselves? Why not share it with the human world? Because there's an extra part to its power. It stops us from speaking about your kind in a way that would endanger or expose them. A charm that bound them from speaking, that sounded suspiciously like compulsion. All Maroi could use compulsion a little, and most could put some of their magic into objects to give them certain properties. Moroi magic had changed over the years, and compulsion was regarded as an immoral thing now. I was guessing this tattoo was an old spell that had come down through the centuries. I replayed the rest of what Sydney had said, more questions spinning in my head. Why do you want to stay away from us? I mean, not that I'm looking to become BFFs or anything. Because it's our duty to God to protect the rest of humanity from evil creatures of the night. Absent-mindedly, her hand went to something at her neck. It was mostly covered by her jacket, but a parting of her collar briefly revealed a golden cross. My initial reaction to that was unease, seeing as I wasn't very religious. In fact, I was never entirely comfortable around those who were hardcore believers. 30 seconds later, the full impact of the rest of her words sank in. Wait a minute, I exclaimed indignantly. Are you talking about all of us Dompiers and Moroi? We're all evil creatures of the night. Her hands dropped from the cross, and she didn't respond. We're not like strigoi. I snapped. Her face stayed bland. Moroi drink blood. Dompiers are the unnatural offspring of them and humans. No one had ever called me unnatural before, except for the time I put ketchup on a taco. But seriously, we'd been out of salsa, so what else was I supposed to do? Moroi and Dompiers are not evil, I told Sydney. Not like strigoi. That's true, she conceded. Strigoi are more evil. Hey, that's not what the food arrived just then, and the fried chicken was almost enough to distract me from the outrage of being compared to a strigoi. Mostly all it did was delay me from responding immediately to her claims, and I bit into the golden crust and nearly melted then and there. Sydney had ordered a cheeseburger and fries and nibbled her food delicately. After taking down an entire chicken leg, I was finally able to resume the argument. We're not like strigoi at all. Moroi don't kill. You have no reason to be afraid of us. Again, I wasn't keen on cozying up to humans. None of my kind were, not with the way humans tended to be trigger-happy and ready to experiment on anything they didn't understand. Any human who learns about you will inevitably learn about strigoi, she said. She was playing with her fries but not actually eating them. Knowing about strigoi might enable humans to protect themselves, though. Why the hell was I playing devil's advocate here? She finished toying with a fry and dropped it back on her plate. Perhaps. But there are a lot of people who would be tempted by the thought of immortality even at the cost of serving strigoi in exchange for being turned into a creature from hell. You'd be surprised at how a lot of humans respond when they learn about vampires. Immortality's a big draw despite the evil that goes with it. A lot of humans who learn about strigoi will try to serve them, in the hopes of eventually being turned. That's insane, I stopped. Last year, we'd discovered evidence of humans helping strigoi. Strigoi couldn't touch silver stakes, but humans could, and some had used those stakes to shatter Moroi wards. Had those humans been promised immortality? And so, said Sydney, that's why it's best if we just make sure no one knows about any of you. You're out there all of you and there's nothing to be done about it. You do your thing to get rid of strigoi, and we'll do ours and save the rest of my kind. I chewed on a chicken wing and restrained myself from the implied meaning that she was saving her kind from people like me, too. In some ways, what she was saying made sense. It wasn't possible that we could always move through the world invisibly, and yes, I could admit, it was necessary for someone to dispose of strigoi bodies. Humans working with Moroi were an ideal choice. Such humans would be able to move around the world freely, particularly if they had the kinds of contacts and connections she kept implying. I froze mid-chew, remembering my earlier thoughts when I'd first come along with Sydney. I forced myself to swallow and then took a long drink of water. Here's a question. Do you have contacts all over Russia? Unfortunately, she said. When alchemists turn 18, we're sent on an internship to get first-hand experience in the trade and make all sorts of connections. I would have rather stayed in Utah. That was almost crazier than everything else she'd told me, but I didn't push it. What kind of connections exactly? She shrugged. We track the movements of a lot of Maroi and Dompirs. We also know a lot of high-ranking government officials among humans and Maroi. If there's been a vampire sighting among humans, we can usually find someone important who can pay someone off or whatever. It all gets swept under the rug. Track the movements of a lot of Maroi and Dompirs. Jackpot. I leaned in close and lowered my voice. Everything seemed to hinge on this moment. I'm looking for a village of Dompirs out in Siberia. I don't know its name. Dimitri had only ever mentioned its name once, and I'd forgotten. It's kind of near. Omsk, she corrected. I straightened up. Do you know it? She didn't answer right away, but her eyes betrayed her. Maybe. You do. I exclaimed. You have to tell me where it is. I have to get there. She made a face. Are you going to be one of those? So alchemists knew about blood whores. No surprise. If Sydney and her associates knew everything else about the vampire world, they'd know this too. No, I said haughtily. I just have to find someone. Who? Someone. That almost made her smile. Her brown eyes were thoughtful as she munched on another fry. She'd only taken 2 bites out of her cheeseburger, and it was rapidly growing cold. I kind of wanted to eat it myself on principle. I'll be right back, she said abruptly. She stood up and strode across to a quiet corner of the cafe. Producing a cell phone from that magic purse of hers, she turned her back to the room and made a call. I'd polished off my chicken by then and helped myself to some of her fries since it was looking less and less like she was going to do anything with them. As I ate, I pondered the possibilities before me, wondering if finding Dimitri's town would really be this simple. And once I was there, would it be simple then? Would he be there, living in the shadows and hunting prey? And when faced with him, could I really drive my stake into his heart? That unwanted image came to me again, Dimitri with red eyes and rose. I blinked. I'd totally spaced out, and Sydney was back. She slid back into her spot across from me. So, it looks like she paused and looked down. Did you eat some of my fries? I had no clue how she knew, seeing as it was such a huge stack. I'd barely made a dent. Figuring me stealing fries would count as further evidence of being an evil creature of the night, I said glibly, no. She frowned a moment, considering, and then said, I do know where this town is. I've been there before. I straightened up. Holy crap. This was actually going to happen, after all these weeks of searching. Sydney would tell me where this place was, and I could go and try to close this horrible chapter in my life. Thank you so much. She held up a hand to silence me, and I noticed then how miserable she looked. But I'm not going to tell you where it is. My mouth gaped. What? I'm going to take you there myself. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 3. Wait, what? I exclaimed. That wasn't in the plan. That wasn't in the plan at all. I was trying to move through Russia in as incognito a way as possible. Plus, I didn't really relish the thought of having a tag-along, particularly one who appeared to hate me. I didn't know how long it would take to get to Siberia. A couple days, I thought, and I couldn't imagine spending them listening to Sydney talk about what an unnatural, evil being I was. Swallowing my outrage, I attempted reason. After all, I was asking a favor here. That's not necessary, I said, forcing a smile. It's nice of you to offer, but I don't want to inconvenience you. Well, she replied dryly, there's no getting around that. And it's not me being nice. It's not even my choice. It's an order from my superiors. It still sounds like a pain in the ass for you. Why don't you just tell me where it is and blow them off? You obviously don't know the people I work for. Don't need to. I ignore authority all the time. It's not hard once you get used to it. Yeah? How's that working out for you with finding this village? She asked mockingly. Look, if you want to get there, this is the only way. Well, it was the only way I could get there if I used Sydney for information. I could always go back to staking out the Nightingale, but it had taken me this long to get a lead from there. Meanwhile, she was here right in front of me with the information I needed. Why? I asked. Why do you have to go too? I can't tell you that. Bottom line, they told me to. Lovely. I eyed her, trying to figure out what was going on here. Why on earth would anyone, let alone humans with their hands in the Maroi world, care where one teenage Domper went? I didn't think Sydney had any ulterior motives unless she was a very, very good actress. Yet, clearly the people she answered to had an agenda, and I didn't like playing into anyone's plan. At the same time, I was anxious to get on with this. Each day that passed was another in which I didn't find Dimitri. How soon can we leave? I asked at last. Sydney, I decided, was a paper pusher. She'd shown no real skill in tracking me earlier. Surely it wouldn't be that hard to ditch her once we were near enough to Dimitri's town. She looked kind of disappointed at my response, almost as though she'd hoped I would decline and then she'd be off the hook. She didn't want to come with me any more than I wanted her to. Opening her purse, she took out her cell phone again, fiddled with it a couple of minutes, and finally produced some train times. She showed me the schedule for the next day. Does that work for you? I studied the screen and nodded. I know where that station is. I can be there. Okay. She stood up and tossed some cash on the table. I'll see you tomorrow. She started to walk away and then glanced back at me. Oh, and you can have the rest of my fries. When I first came to Russia, I stayed in youth hostels. I'd certainly had the money to stay elsewhere, but I wanted to remain under the radar. Besides, luxury hadn't really been the first thing on my mind. When I began going to the Nightingale, however, I found I could hardly return to a boarding house of backpacking students while wearing a designer dress. So I was now staying at a posh hotel, complete with guys who always held the doors open and a marble-floored lobby. That lobby was so big that I think an entire hostel could have fit in it. Maybe 2 hostels. My room was large and overdone too, and I was grateful to reach it and change out of the heels and dress. I realized with only a small pang of regret that I'd have to leave the dresses I'd bought in St. Petersburg behind. I wanted to keep my luggage light while jaunting around the country, and even if my backpack was large, there was only so much I could carry. Oh well. Those dresses would make some cleaning woman's day, no doubt. The only bit of ornamentation I really needed was my nazar, a pendant that looked like a blue eye. It had been a gift from my mother, which had in turn been a gift from my father. I always wore it around my neck. Our train for Moscow left late in the morning, and we would then catch a cross-country train to Siberia. I wanted to be well rested and ready for it all. Once in my pajamas, I snuggled under the bed's heavy comforter and hoped sleep would come soon. Instead, my mind spun with all the things that had happened recently. The Sydney situation was a bizarre twist, but one I could handle. As long as we stuck to public transportation, she could hardly lead me into the clutches of her mysterious superiors. And from what she'd said about our travel time, it would indeed only take a couple of days or so to reach the village. 2 days seemed both impossibly long and impossibly short. It meant I could very well be confronting Dimitri in a few days, and then what? Could I do it? Could I bring myself to kill him? And even if I decided I could, would I actually have the skill to overpower him? The same questions that I'd been asking myself for the last 2 weeks kept plaguing me over and over. Dimitri had taught me everything I knew, and with enhanced strigoi reflexes, he would truly be the god I'd always joked he was. Death was a very real possibility for me. but worrying wasn't helpful right now and, looking over at the clock in the room, I discovered I'd been lying awake for almost an hour. That was no good. I needed to be in peak condition. So I did something I knew I shouldn't do, but which always worked to get my mind off my worries, largely because it involved me being in someone else's mind. Slipping inside Lissa's head required only a small amount of concentration on my part. I hadn't known if I could do it when we were far apart, but I'd discovered the process was no different than if I were standing right beside her. It was late morning back in Montana, and Lissa had no classes today since it was Saturday. During my time away, I'd worked very hard to put up mental walls between us, almost completely blocking her and her feelings out. Now, inside her, all the barriers were down, and her emotions hit me like a tidal wave. She was pissed off. Really pissed off. Why does she think she can just snap her fingers and get me to go anywhere she wants, anytime she wants? Lissa growled. Because she's the queen. And because you made a deal with the devil. Lissa and her boyfriend, Christian, were lounging in the attic of the school's chapel. As soon as I recognized the surroundings, I nearly pulled out of her head. The two of them had had way too many romantic encounters up here, and I didn't want to stick around if clothes were going to be ripped off soon. Fortunately, or perhaps not, her annoyed feelings told me there'd be no sex today, not with her bad mood. It was kind of ironic, actually. Their roles were reversed. Lissa was the raging one while Christian remained cool and collected, trying to appear calm for her sake. He sat on the floor, leaning up against the wall, while she sat in front of him, his legs apart and his arms holding her. She rested her head on his chest and sighed. For the last few weeks, I've done everything she's asked. Vasilisa, please show this stupid visiting royal around campus. Vasilisa, please jump on a plane for the weekend so that I can introduce you to some boring officials here at court. Vasilisa, please put in some volunteer time with the younger students. It looks good. Despite Lissa's frustration, I couldn't help a little amusement. She had Queen Tatiana's voice down perfectly. You would have done that last one willingly, Christian pointed out. Yeah, the point being willingly. I hate her trying to dictate every part of my life lately. Christian leaned over and kissed her cheek. Like I said, you made a deal with the devil. You're her darling now. She wants to make sure you're making her look good. Lissa scowled. Although Maroi lived inside human-run countries and were subject to those governments, they were also ruled by a king or queen who came from one of the 12 royal Maroi families. Queen Tatiana Ivashkov was the current ruler, and she'd taken a particular interest in Lissa as the last living member of the Dragomir family. As such, Tatiana had cut Lissa a deal. If Lissa lived at court after graduating from St. Vladimir's, the queen would arrange for her to attend Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. Lissa was a total brain and thought living in Tatiana's household would be worth it to attend a semi-big, prestigious university, as opposed to the tiny ones Maroi usually went to, for safety reasons. As Lissa was finding out, though, the strings attached to that deal were already in place now. And I just sit and take it, Lissa said. I just smile and say yes, Your Majesty. Anything you want, Your Majesty. Then tell her the deal's off. You'll be 18 in a couple of months. Royal or not, you're under no obligations. You don't need her to go to a big school. We'll just take off, you and me. Go to whatever college you want. Or don't go to college at all. We can run off to Paris or something and work at a little cafe. Or sell bad art on the streets. This actually made Lissa laugh, and she snuggled closer to Christian. Right. I can totally see you having the patience to wait on people. You'd be fired your first day. Looks like the only way we'll survive is if I go to college and support us. There are other ways to get to college, you know. Yeah, but not to any that are this good, she said wistfully. Not easily, at least. This is the only way. I just wish I could have all this and stand up to her a little. Rose would. Rose would have gotten herself arrested for treason the first time Tatiana asked her to do something. Lissa smiled sadly. Yeah. She would have. The smile turned into a sigh. I miss her so much. Christian kissed her again. I know. This was a familiar conversation for them, one that never grew old because Lissa's feelings for me never faded. She's okay, you know. Wherever she is, she's okay. Lissa stared off into the attic's darkness. The only light came from a stained glass window that made the whole place look like a fairyland. The space had been recently cleaned out by Dimitri and me, actually. It had only been a couple of months ago, but already, dust and boxes were accumulating once more. The priest here was a nice guy but kind of a pack rat. Lissa noticed none of this, though. Her thoughts were too focused on me. I hope so. I wish I had any idea where she is. I keep thinking that if anything happened to her, Lissa couldn't finish the thought. Well, I keep thinking that I'd know somehow. That I'd feel it. I mean, I know the bond's one way, that's never changed. But I'd have to know if something happened to her, right? I don't know, said Christian. Maybe. Maybe not. Any other guy would have said something overly sweet and comforting, assuring her that yes, of course she'd know. But it was part of Christian's nature to be brutally honest. Lissa liked that about him. So did I. It didn't always make him a pleasant friend, but at least you knew he wasn't bullshitting you. She sighed again. Adrian says she's okay. He visits her dreams. I'd give anything to be able to do that. My healing's getting better and better, and I've got the aura thing down. But no dreams yet. Knowing Lissa missed me hurt almost more than if she'd completely written me off. I'd never wanted to hurt her. Even when I'd resented her for feeling like she was controlling my life, I'd never hated her. I loved her like a sister and couldn't stand the thought of her suffering now on my behalf. How had things gotten so screwed up between us? She and Christian continued sitting there in comfortable silence, drawing strength and love from each other. They had what Dimitri and I had had, a sense of such oneness and familiarity that words often weren't needed. He ran his fingers through her hair, and while I couldn't see it so well through her own eyes, I could imagine the way that pale hair would gleam in the rainbow light of the stained glass windows. He tucked several long locks behind her ear and then tipped her head back, bringing his lips down to hers. The kiss started off light and sweet and then slowly intensified, warmth spreading from his mouth to hers. Oh, I thought. It might be time to take off after all. But she ended it before I had to. It's time, she said regretfully. We've got to go. The look in Christian's crystal blue eyes said otherwise. Maybe this is the perfect time for you to stand up to the queen. You should just stay here, it'd be a great way to build character. Lissa lightly elbowed him and then planted a kiss on his forehead before standing up. That is not why you want me to stay, so don't even try to play me. They left the chapel, and Christian mumbled something about wanting to do more than play that earned him another elbow. They were heading toward the administration building, which was in the heart of the upper school's campus. Aside from the first blushes of spring, everything looked like it had when I'd left, at least on the outside. The stone buildings remained grand and imposing. The tall, ancient trees continued their watch. Yet, inside the hearts of the staff and students, things had changed. Everyone carried scars from the attack. Many of our people had been killed, and while classes were up and running again, everyone still grieved. Lissa and Christian reached their destination, the administration building. She didn't know the reason for her summoning, only that Tatiana had wanted her to meet some royal guy who had just arrived at the academy. Considering how many people Tatiana was always forcing her to meet lately, Lissa didn't think too much of it. She and Christian stepped inside the main office, where they found Headmistress Kirova sitting and chatting with an older Maroi and a girl about our age. Ah, Miss Dragomir. There you are. I'd gotten in trouble with Kirova a lot while I'd been a student, yet seeing her now made me feel kind of nostalgic. Getting suspended for starting a fight in class seemed worlds better than traipsing through Siberia to find Dimitri. Kirova had the same bird-like appearance she'd always had, the same glasses balanced at the end of her nose. The man and girl stood up, and Kirova gestured to them. This is Eugene Lazar and his daughter Avery. Kirova turned back toward Lisa. This is Vasilisa Dragomir and Christian Ozera. A fair bit of sizing up went on then. Lazar was a royal name, but that was no surprise since Tatiana had initiated this meeting. Mr. Lazar gave Lisa a winning smile as he shook her hand. He seemed a bit surprised to meet Christian, but the smile stayed. Of course, that kind of reaction to Christian wasn't so unusual. The two ways to become strigoi were by choice or by force. A strigoi could turn another person human, maroi, or damper by drinking their blood and then feeding strigoi blood back to them. That was what had happened to Dimitri. The other way to become strigoi was unique to maroi and it was done by choice. Maroi who purposely chose to kill a person by drinking blood would also turn strigoi. Usually, maroi only drank small, non-lethal amounts from willing humans. But taking so much that it destroyed another's life force? Well, that turned maroi to the dark side, taking away their elemental magic and transforming them into the twisted undead. That was exactly what Christian's parents had done. They'd willingly killed and become strigoi to gain eternal life. Christian had never shown any desire to become strigoi, but everyone acted as though he were about to. Admittedly, his snarky attitude didn't always help. A lot of his close family despite being royal had been unfairly shunned as well. He and I had teamed up to kick a fair amount of strigoi ass during the attack, though. Word of that was getting around and improving his reputation. Kirova was never one to waste time with formalities, so she got straight to the point. Mr. Lazar is going to be the new headmaster here. Lisa had still been smiling at him politely, but her head immediately jerked toward Kirova. What? I'm going to be stepping down, explained Kirova, voice flat and emotionless enough to rival any guardians. Though I'll still be serving the school as a teacher. You're going to teach? Christian asked incredulously. She gave him a dry look. Yes, Mr. Ozera. It was what I originally went to school for. I'm sure if I try hard enough, I can remember how to do it. But why? Asked Lisa. You do a great job. It was more or less true. Despite my disputes with Kirova usually over me breaking rules, I still had a healthy respect for her. Lisa did too. It's something I've thought about returning to for some time, explained Kirova. Now seemed as good a time as any, and Mr. Lazar is a very capable administrator. Lisa was pretty good at reading people. I think it was part of Spirit's side effects, along with how Spirit made its users very, very charismatic. Lisa thought Kirova was lying, and so did I. If I'd been able to read Christian's mind, my guess would have been that he felt the same way. The attack on the academy had sent a lot of people into a panic, royals in particular, even though the problem that had led to the attack had long since been fixed. I was guessing that Tatiana's hand was at work here, forcing Kirova to step down and have a royal take her place, thus making other royals feel better. Lisa didn't let her thoughts show, and she turned back to Mr. Lazar. Well, it's very nice to meet you. I'm sure you'll do a great job. Let me know if there's anything I can do for you. She was playing the proper princess role perfectly. Being polite and sweet was one of her many talents. Actually, said Mr. Lazar, there is. He had a deep, booming voice, the kind that filled a room. He gestured toward his daughter. I was wondering if you could show Avery around and help her find her way here. She graduated last year but will be assisting me in my duties. I'm sure she'd much rather be spending time with someone her own age, however. Avery smiled, and for the first time, Lisa really paid attention to her. Avery was beautiful. Stunning. Lissa was beautiful too, between that gorgeous hair and the jade green eyes that ran in her family. I thought she was 100 times prettier than Avery, but beside the older girl, Lissa felt kind of plain. Avery was tall and slim like most Maroi but had a few sexy curves thrown in. That kind of chest, like mine, was coveted among Maroi, and her long brown hair and blue-gray eyes completed the package. "I promise not to be too much of a pain," said Avery. "And if you want, I'll give you some insider's tips on court life. I hear you're going to be moving there." Instantly, Lissa's defenses went up. She realized what was going on. Not only had Tatiana ousted Kirova, she'd sent a keeper for Lissa. A beautiful, perfect companion who could spy on Lissa and attempt to train her up to Tatiana's standards. Lissa's words were perfectly polite when she spoke, but there was a definite edge of frost in her voice. "That'd be great," she said. "I'm pretty busy lately, but we can try to make the time." Neither Avery's father nor Kirova seemed to notice the back-off subtext, but something flashed in Avery's eyes that told Lissa the message had come through. "Thanks," said Avery. Unless I was mistaken, there was some legitimate hurt in her face. "I'm sure we'll figure something out." "Good, good," said Mr. Lazar, totally oblivious to the girl drama. "Maybe you can show Avery to guest housing? She's staying in the East Wing." "Sure," said Lissa, wishing she could do anything but that. She, Christian, and Avery started to leave, but just then, two guys entered the room. One was a Maroi, a little younger than us, and the other was a Domper in his 20s, a guardian, from the look of his hard, serious features. "Ah, there you are," said Mr. Lazar, beckoning the guys in. He rested his hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is my son Reed. He's a junior and will be attending classes here. He's very excited about it." Actually, Reed looked extremely unexcited. He was pretty much the surliest guy I'd ever seen. If I ever needed to play the role of a disgruntled teen, I could have learned everything there was to know about it from Reed Lazar. He had the same good looks and features as Avery, but they were marred by a grimace that seemed permanently attached to his face. Mr. Lazar introduced the others to Reed. Reed's only response was a guttural, "Hey." "And this is Simon, Avery's guardian," continued Mr. Lazar. "Of course, while on campus, he doesn't need to be with her all the time. You know how it goes. Still, I'm sure you'll see him around." "I hope not." He didn't look as completely unpleasant as Reed, but he had a certain dour nature that seemed extreme even among guardians. Suddenly, I kind of felt sorry for Avery. If this was her only company, I'd want to befriend someone like Lissa pretty badly. Lissa, however, made it clear that she wouldn't be part of Tatiana's schemes. With little conversation, she and Christian escorted Avery to guest housing and promptly left. Normally, Lissa would have stayed to help Avery get settled and offered to eat with her later. Not this time. Not with ulterior motives afoot. I came back to my own body, back in the hotel. I knew I shouldn't care about academy life anymore and that I should even feel bad for Avery. Yet lying there and staring into the darkness, I couldn't help but take some smug and yes, very selfish satisfaction out of this encounter. Lissa wouldn't be shopping for a new best friend anytime soon. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 4. At any other time in my life, I would have loved exploring Moscow. Sydney had planned our trip so that when our train arrived there, we'd have a few hours before we had to board the next one to Siberia. This gave us some time to wander around and grab dinner, though she wanted to make sure we were safely inside the station before it grew too dark out. Despite my badass claims or my Malnija marks, she didn't want to take any chances. It made no difference to me how we spent our downtime. So long as I was getting closer to Dimitri, that was all that mattered. So Sydney and I walked aimlessly, taking in the sights and saying very little. I had never been to Moscow. It was a beautiful city, thriving and full of people and commerce. I could have spent days there just shopping and trying out the restaurants. Places I'd heard about all my life, the Kremlin, Red Square, the Bolshoi Theater, were all at my fingertips. Despite how cool it all was, I actually tried to tune out the city's sights and sounds after a while because it reminded me of, well, Dimitri. He used to talk to me about Russia all the time and had sworn up and down that I'd love it here. To you, it'd be like a fairy tale, he'd told me once. It was during a before-school practice late last autumn, just before the first snowfall. The air had been misty, and dew coated everything. Sorry, comrade, I'd replied, reaching back to tie my hair into a ponytail. Dimitri had always loved my hair down, but in combat practice, long hair was a total liability. Borg and out-of-date music aren't part of any happy ending I've ever imagined. He'd given me one of his rare, easy grins then, the kind that just slightly crinkled up the corners of his eyes. Borscht, not Borg. And I've seen your appetite. If you were hungry enough, you'd eat it. So starvation's necessary for this fairy tale to work out. There was nothing I loved more than teasing Dimitri. Well, aside from maybe kissing him. I'm talking about the land. The buildings. Go to one of the big cities, it's like nothing you've ever seen. Everyone in the US tends to build the same, always in big, chunky blocks. They do what's fast and easy. But in Russia, there are buildings that are like pieces of art. They are art, even a lot of the ordinary, everyday buildings. And places like the Winter Palace and Troitsky Church in St. Petersburg? Those will take your breath away. His face had been aglow with the memory of sights he'd seen, that joy making his already handsome features divine. I think he could have named landmarks all day. My heart had burned within me, just from watching him. And then, just like I always did when I worried I might turn sappy or sentimental, I'd made a joke to shift the attention away and hide my emotions. It had switched him back into business mode, and we'd gotten to work. Now, walking the city streets with Sydney, I wished I could take back that joke and listen to Dimitri talk more about his homeland. I would have given anything to have Dimitri with me here, the way he used to be. He'd been right about the buildings. Sure, most were blocky copies of anything you'd find in the US or anywhere else in the world, but some were exquisite, painted with bright colors, adorned with their strange yet beautiful onion-shaped domes. At times, it really did seem like something from another world. And all the while, I kept thinking that it should have been Dimitri here by my side, pointing things out and explaining them to me. We should have been having a romantic getaway. Dimitri and I could have eaten at exotic restaurants and then gone dancing at night. I could have worn one of the designer dresses I'd had to leave behind in the St. Petersburg hotel. That's how it was supposed to be. It wasn't supposed to be me with a glowering human. Unreal, huh? Like something from a story? Sydney's voice startled me, and I realized we'd come to a stop in front of our train station. There were a number of them in Moscow. Her echoing of my conversation with Dimitri sent chills down my spine, largely because she was right. The station didn't have the onion domes but still looked like something straight out of a storybook, like a cross between Cinderella's castle and a gingerbread house. It had a big arched roof and towers on either end. Its white walls were interspersed with patches of brown brick and green mosaic, almost making it look striped. In the US, some might have called it gaudy. To me, it was beautiful. I felt tears start to spring to my eyes as I wondered what Dimitri would have said about this building. He probably would have loved it just as he loved everything else here. Realizing that Sydney was waiting for a response, I swallowed back my grief and played flippant teenager. Maybe something from a story about a train station. She arched an eyebrow, surprised at my indifference, but she didn't question it. Who could say? Maybe if I kept up the sarcasm, she'd eventually get annoyed and ditch me. Somehow, I doubted I'd be that lucky. I was pretty sure her fear of her superiors trumped any other feelings she might have in regard to me. We had first-class train accommodations, which turned out to be a lot smaller than I expected. There was a combination bed/sitting bench on each side, a window, and a TV high on the wall. I supposed that would help pass the time, but I often had trouble following Russian television, not just because of the language but also because some of the shows were downright bizarre. Still, Sydney and I would each have our own space, even if the room was cozier than we would have liked. The colors reminded me a lot of the same fanciful patterns I'd seen throughout the cities. Even the hall outside our cabin was brightly colored, with plush carpet in red and yellow designs and a teal and yellow runner going down the middle. Inside our room, the benches were covered in cushions with rich orange velvet, and the curtains matched in shades of gold and peach, made of thick heavy fabric embossed with a silky pattern. Between all that and the ornate table in the middle of the cabin, it was almost like traveling in a mini palace. It was dark out by the time the train left the station. For whatever reason, the Trans-Siberian always left Moscow at night. It wasn't that late yet, but Sydney said she wanted to sleep, and I didn't want to make her more irate than she already was. So we turned off all the lights, save for a tiny reading lamp by my bed. I'd bought a magazine at the train station, and even if I couldn't understand the language, the pictures of makeup and clothes transcended all cultural barriers. I flipped through the pages as quietly as I could, admiring summer tops and dresses and wondering when if ever I'd be able to start worrying about that kind of thing again. I wasn't tired when I lay down, but sleep took me nonetheless. I was dreaming about water skiing when suddenly, the waves and sun around me dissolved into a room lined with shelves and shelves of books. Tables with state-of-the-art computers lined the rooms, and there was a calmness that permeated the place. I was in the library at St. Vladimir's Academy. I groaned. Oh, come on. Not today. Why not today? Why not every day? I turned and found myself looking into the handsome face of Adrian Ivashkov. Adrian was a Maroi, the Queen's great-nephew, and someone I'd left behind in my old life when I took off on this suicide mission. He had beautiful emerald green eyes that made most girls swoon, particularly since they were paired with stylishly messy brown hair. He was also kind of in love with me and the reason I had so much money on this trip. I'd sweet-talked him out of it. True, I admitted. I suppose I should be grateful you only show up about once a week. He grinned and sat down backward in one of the slatted wooden chairs. He was tall, like most Maroi, with a leanly muscled build. Maroi guys never got too bulky. Absence makes the heart grow fonder, Rose. Don't want you to take me for granted. We're in no danger of that, don't worry. I don't suppose you're going to tell me where you are. Nope. Aside from Lissa, Adrian was the only other known living spirit user, and among his talents was the ability to show up in my dreams often uninvited and talk to me. I took it as a blessing that his powers never actually let him know where I was. You kill me, Rose, he said melodramatically. Every day is agony without you. Empty. Alone. I pine for you, wondering if you're even still alive. He spoke in an exaggerated, silly sort of way that was characteristic of him. Adrian rarely took things seriously and always had a flippant edge. Spirit also had a tendency to make people unstable, and while he fought it, he wasn't unaffected. Underneath that melodrama, though, I sensed a kernel of truth. No matter how shallow an appearance he gave off, he really did care about me. I crossed my arms. Well, I'm still alive, clearly. So I guess you can let me go back to sleep. How many times have I told you? You are asleep. And yet I inexplicably feel exhausted talking to you. This made him laugh. Oh, I do so miss you. That smile faded. She misses you too. I stiffened. She. He didn't even need to say her name. There was no question as to whom he was talking about. Lissa. Even saying her name in my mind caused me pain, particularly after seeing her last night. Choosing between Lisa and Dimitri had been the hardest decision of my life, and time passing hadn't made it any easier. I might have chosen him, but being away from her was like having an arm cut off, particularly because the bond ensured we were never truly apart. Adrian gave me a canny look, like he could guess my thoughts. "Do you go see her?" "No," I said, refusing to acknowledge that I'd just seen her last night. Let him think I was truly free of all that. That's not my life anymore. Right. Your life is all about dangerous vigilante missions. You wouldn't understand anything that isn't drinking, smoking, or womanizing. He shook his head. "You're the only one I want, Rose." Unfortunately, I believed him. It would have been easier for both of us if he could find someone else. "Well, you can keep feeling that way, but you're going to have to keep waiting." "Much longer?" He asked me this all the time, and every time, I emphasized how long it would be and how he was wasting his time. Thinking of Sydney's possible lead, I hesitated tonight. "I don't know." Hope blossomed on Adrian's face. "That's the most optimistic thing you've told me so far. Don't read too much into it. I don't know, could be 1 day or 1 year. Or never." His mischievous grin returned, and even I had to admit it was cute. "I'm going to hope it's 1 day." Thinking of Sydney brought a question to my mind. "Hey, have you ever heard of the alchemists?" "Sure," he said. "Typical. Of course you have. What? Did you run into them?" "Kind of." "What did you do? Why do you think I did anything?" He laughed. "Alchemists only show up when trouble happens, and you bring trouble wherever you go. Be careful, though. They're religious nuts." "That's kind of extreme," I said. "Sydney's fate didn't seem to be anything bad. Just don't let them convert you." He winked. "I like you being the sinner you are." I started to tell him that Sydney probably thought I was beyond all salvation, but he ended the dream, sending me back to sleep. Except, instead of returning to my own dreams, I woke up. Around me, the train hummed comfortingly as we sped through the Russian countryside. My reading lamp was still on, its light too bright for my sleepy eyes. I reached over to turn it off and noticed then that Sydney's bed was empty. Probably in the bathroom, I thought. Yet, I felt uneasy. She and her group of alchemists were still mysteries, and I suddenly worried that she might have some sinister plan going on. Was she off meeting with some covert operative? I decided to find her. Admittedly, I had no idea where she could be on a train of this size, but logic had never really deterred me before. No reason they should now. Thankfully, after slipping on my shoes and stepping out in the hall adjacent to our cabin, I discovered I didn't have to look very far. The corridor was lined with windows, all draped in those rich curtains, and Sydney stood with her back to me, gazing outside, a blanket wrapped around her. Her hair was messy from sleep and looked less gold in the poor lighting. "Hey." I began hesitantly. "Are you okay?" She turned slightly toward me. One hand held the blanket, the other played with the cross around her neck. I remembered Adrian's comments about religion. "I can't sleep," she said bluntly. Is it because of me?" Her only answer was to turn back to the window. "Look," I said, feeling helpless. "If there's anything I can do. I mean, aside from going back and canceling the strip." "I'll handle it," she said. "This is just, well, it's really strange for me. I deal with you guys all the time, but I don't actually deal with you, you know. We could probably get you a room of your own, if that would help. We can find an attendant, and I've got the money." She shook her head. "It's just a couple of days, if that." I didn't know what else to say. Having Sydney along was inconvenient in the grand scheme of my plans, but I didn't want her to suffer. Watching her play with the cross, I tried to think of something comforting to tell her. Bonding over our views of God might have been a way to get closer, but somehow, I didn't think telling her how I had daily battles with God and doubted his existence lately would really help me out with the whole evil creature of the night reputation. "Okay," I said at last. "Let me know if you change your mind." I returned to my bed and fell asleep surprisingly fast, despite worrying that Sydney would be standing in the hall all night. Yet, when I woke in the morning, she was curled up on her bed, fast asleep. Apparently, her exhaustion had been so strong that even fear of me had driven her to rest. I got up quietly and changed out of the t-shirt and sweatpants I'd gone to bed in. I was hungry for breakfast and figured Sydney might sleep longer if I wasn't around. The restaurant was in the next car over and looked like something out of an old movie. Elegant burgundy linens draped the tables, and brass and dark wood, along with bits of bright-colored stained glass art, gave the whole place an antique feel. It looked more like a restaurant I'd find on the streets of St. Petersburg than a train dining car. I ordered something that reminded me vaguely of French toast, except that it had cheese on it. It came with sausage, which thus far seemed to be the same everywhere I went. I was just about finished when Sydney wandered in. When I'd met her that first night, I'd assumed her dress pants and blouse had been for the sake of the nightingale. I was discovering, however, that was her normal style. She struck me as one of those people who didn't own jeans or t-shirts. She'd been mussed while standing in the hall last night, but now she was in neat black slacks and a dark green sweater. I was in jeans and a long-sleeved gray thermal shirt and felt kind of sloppy beside her. Her hair was brushed and styled but had a slightly messy look that I suspected never went away, no matter how hard she tried. At least I had my sleek ponytail going for me today. She slid across from me and ordered an omelette when the server came by, again speaking in Russian. "How do you know that?" I asked. "What, Russian?" She shrugged. "I had to learn it growing up. And a few other languages." Wow. I had taken intros to a couple of languages too and performed miserably in all of them. I hadn't thought much of it at the time, but now, because of this trip and because of Dimitri, I really wished I'd learned Russian. I supposed it wasn't too late, and I had picked up a few phrases in my time here, but still, it was a daunting task. "You must have to learn a lot of stuff for this job," I mused, pondering what it must mean to be part of a secret group that crossed international lines and interacted with all sorts of governments. Something else crossed my mind. "And what about that stuff you used on the strigoi? That disintegrated the body?" She smiled. "Almost. Well, I told you the alchemists started off as a group of people trying to make potions, right? That's a chemical we developed to get rid of strigoi bodies fast. Could you use it to actually kill one?" I asked. Dousing a strigoi in some dissolving liquid would be a lot easier than the usual ways: decapitation, staking, or burning. "Afraid not. Only works on corpses." "Bummer," I said. I wondered if she had other potions up her sleeve but figured I should ration my amount of Sydney questions for the day. "What are we going to do when we get to Omsk?" "Omsk," she corrected. "We'll get a car and drive the rest of the way." "Have you been there? To this village?" She nodded. "Once." "What's it like?" I asked, surprised to hear a wistful note in my own voice. Aside from my quest to find Dimitri, there was a piece of me that just wanted to cling to everything I could of him. I wanted to know everything about him that I hadn't known before. If the school had given me his possessions, I would have slept with them each night. His room had been cleared out pretty quickly, though. Now I could only gather what pieces of him I could, as though hoarding these bits of information would keep him with me somehow. It's like any other Domper town, I guess. I've never been to one. The server set Sydney's omelette down, and she paused with her fork in the air. "Really? I thought all of you, well, I don't know." I shook my head. "I've been at the academy my whole life. More or less. My 2-year stint among humans wasn't really relevant. Sydney chewed thoughtfully. I was willing to wager she wouldn't finish the omelette. From what I'd seen that first night and while waiting for trains yesterday, she hardly seemed to eat anything. It was like she subsisted on air alone. Maybe it was another alchemist thing. Most likely it was just a Sydney thing. The town is half human and half Domper, but the Dompiers blend in. They have a whole underground society that the humans are completely oblivious to. I'd always figured there was a whole subculture going on, but I'd had no idea how it would fit into the rest of the town. And I asked, "What's that subculture like?" She set her fork down. "Let's just say you'd better brace yourself. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 5." The rest of the trip passed uneventfully. Sydney never entirely lost that discomfort she seemed to have around me, but sometimes, while I was trying to figure out Russian television, she'd take the time to explain what was going on. There were some cultural differences between these shows and the ones we'd both grown up with, so we had that in common. Every once in a while, she'd crack a smile over something we both found funny, and I'd sense there was someone in there I could possibly be friends with. I knew there was no way I'd ever find a replacement for Lissa, but I think some part of me still longed to fill the void of friendship that had been opened up when I left her behind. Sydney napped throughout the day, and I began to think she was just an insomniac with bizarre sleep patterns. She also continued her equally odd treatment of food, hardly touching her meals. She always let me have the leftovers and was a bit more adventurous with Russian cuisine. I'd had to experiment when I first arrived, and it was nice to have the guidance of someone who, though not a local, knew a lot more about this country than me. On the third day of our trip, we arrived in Omsk. Omsk was a larger and prettier city than I'd expected of Siberia. Dimitri had always teased me that my images of Siberia looking like Antarctica were wrong, and I could tell that he was right, at least as far as the southern part of the region was concerned. The weather wasn't much different from what I'd have found in Montana this time of year, cool spring air occasionally warmed by sunshine. Sydney had told me when we got there, she'd get us a ride from some Maroi she knew. Several lived in the city, blending in with the large population. Yet as the day went on, we discovered a problem. No Maroi would take us to the village. Apparently, the road was dangerous. Strigoi often hung out near it at night, hoping to catch traveling Maroi or Dompiers. The more Sydney explained it, the more worried I became about my plan. Apparently, there weren't many strigoi in Dimitri's town itself. According to her, they lurked on the town's periphery, but few lived out there permanently. If that was the case, my odds of finding Dimitri had dropped. Things got even worse as Sydney continued describing the situation. A lot of strigoi travel the country looking for victims, and the village is just an area they pass through, she explained. The road is kind of remote, so some strigoi will stay for a while and try to get easy prey. Then they move on. In the US, strigoi often hide in large cities, I said uneasily. They do that here too. It's easier for them to take victims without being noticed. Yes, this definitely threw a wrench into my plans. If Dimitri wasn't residing in this town, I was going to have some serious problems. I'd known strigoi liked big cities, but somehow, I'd convinced myself Dimitri would return to the place where he grew up. But if Dimitri wasn't there, well, suddenly, the enormity of Siberia hit me. I'd learned Omsk wasn't even the biggest city in the region, and finding even one strigoi here could be hard. Looking for him in any number of cities that might be larger? Things could get very, very ugly if my hunch proved wrong. Since setting out to find Dimitri, I'd occasionally had weak moments in which I half hoped I'd never find him. The idea of him as a strigoi still tormented me. I was also visited by other images of the way he'd been and memories of the time we'd spent together. I think my most precious memory was of just before he was turned. It was one of those times when I'd sucked up a lot of the spirit-induced darkness from Lissa. I'd been out of control, unable to get a grip. I was afraid of becoming a monster, afraid of killing myself like another shadow-kissed guardian had. Dimitri had brought me back to myself, lending me his strength. I'd realized then just how strong our connection was, how perfectly we understood each other. I'd been skeptical about people being soulmates in the past, but at that moment, I knew it was true. And with that emotional connection had come a physical one. Dimitri and I had finally given in to the attraction. We'd sworn we never would, but, well, our feelings were just too strong. Staying away from each other had turned out to be impossible. We'd had sex, and it had been my first time ever. Sometimes I felt certain it would be my only time. The act itself had been amazing, and I'd been unable to separate the physical joy from the emotional. Afterward, we'd lain together in that small cabin for as long as we dared, and that had been amazing too. It had been one of the few moments where I'd felt he was truly mine. "Do you remember Victor's lust charm?" I had asked, snuggling closer against him. Dimitri looked at me like I was crazy. Of course. Victor Dashkov was a royal Maroi, one who had been friends with Lisa and her family. Little did we know that he'd secretly studied spirit for years and had identified Lisa as a spirit user before she even knew. He'd tortured her with all sorts of mind games that truly made her think she was going crazy. His schemes had fully culminated in his kidnapping and torturing her until she healed the disease that was killing him. Victor was now in prison for life, both for what he'd done to Lisa and because of his treasonous plans for rebellion against the Maroi government. He had been one of the few to know about my relationship with Dimitri, something that had worried me to no end. He'd even furthered our relationship by creating a lust charm, a necklace infused with earth and compulsion. The charm was full of dangerous magic that had made Dimitri and me give in to our most basic instincts. We had pulled back at the last moment, and until our night in the cabin, I had believed our charm-induced encounter to be the ultimate physical high. I didn't realize it could get better, I had told Dimitri after we'd actually slept together. I felt a little shy talking about it. I thought about it all the time, what happened between us. He turned to me, tugging the covers up. The cabin was cold, but its bed had warm blankets. I suppose we could have put clothes on, but that was the last thing I wanted to do. Being pressed skin to skin felt too good. I did too. You did? I asked, surprised. I don't know. I thought you were too disciplined for that. I thought you'd try to forget it. Dimitri laughed and kissed my neck. Rose, how could I forget being naked with someone as beautiful as you? I stayed awake so many nights, replaying every detail. I told myself over and over that it was wrong, but you're impossible to forget. His lips moved to my collarbone, and his hand stroked my hip. You're burned into my mind forever. There is nothing in this world that will ever change that. And it was memories like that that made it so hard to comprehend this quest to kill him, even if he was a strigoi. Yet, at the same time, it was exactly because of memories like that that I had to destroy him. I needed to remember him as the man who'd loved me and held me in bed. I needed to remember that that man would not want to stay a monster. I wasn't very excited when Sydney showed me the car she'd bought, particularly since I'd given her the money for it. We're going in that, I exclaimed. Can it even make it that far? The trip was apparently 7 hours. She gave me a shocked look. Are you serious? Do you know what this is? It's a 1972 Citroën. These things are amazing. Do you have any idea how hard it would have been to get this into the country back in the Soviet days? I can't believe that guy actually sold it. He's clueless. I knew little about the Soviet era and even less about classic cars, but Sydney stroked the shiny red hood like she was in love. Who would have guessed? She was a car geek. Maybe it was valuable, and I just couldn't appreciate it. I was more into sleek, brand new sports cars. To be fair, this car didn't have any dents or rust, and aside from an outdated look, it appeared clean and well cared for. "Will it run?" I asked. If possible, her expression grew even more incredulous. "Of course." And it did. The engine sprang to life with a steady hum, and with the way it accelerated, I started to understand her fascination. She wanted to drive, and I was about to argue that it had been my money that bought it. Seeing the adoring look on her face, though, I finally decided not to come between her and the car. I was just glad we were leaving right away. It was already late afternoon. If the road was as dangerous as everyone claimed, we wouldn't want to be out there while it was dark. Sydney agreed but said we could get most of the trip in before sundown and then stay overnight at a place she knew. We'd arrive at our destination in the morning. The farther we drove from Omsk, the more remote the terrain became. As I studied it, I began to understand Dimitri's love of this land. It had a scrubby, barren look, true, but spring was turning the plains green, and there was something hauntingly beautiful about seeing all this untouched wilderness. It reminded me of Montana in some ways yet had a certain quality that was all its own. I couldn't help but use Sydney's crush on the car as a means of conversation. "Do you know a lot about cars?" I asked. "Some," she said. "My dad's the alchemist in our family, but my mom's a mechanic." "Really?" I asked, surprised. "That's kind of unusual." Of course, I was hardly one to talk about gender roles. Considering my life was dedicated to fighting and killing, I couldn't really claim to have a traditionally feminine job either. "She's really good and taught me a lot. I wouldn't have minded doing that for a living. Wouldn't have minded going to college, either." There was a bitter note in her voice. "I guess there are a lot of other things I wish I could do." "Why can't you?" "I had to be the next family alchemist. My sister, well, she's older, and usually it's the oldest kid who has to do the job. But, she's kind of worthless." "That's harsh." "Yeah, maybe. But she just couldn't handle this kind of thing. When it comes to organizing her lip gloss collection, she's unstoppable. But managing the kinds of networks and people we do? No, she'd never be able to do it." "Dad said I was the only one capable of it." "That's a compliment, at least. I guess." Sydney looked so sad now that I felt bad for bringing it up. "If you could go to college, what would you study?" "Greek and Roman architecture." I decided then it was a good thing I wasn't behind the wheel, because I probably would have driven off the road. "Seriously? You know anything about it?" No. It's amazing." The sad expression was replaced by one of wonder. She looked nearly as enamored as she'd been of the car. I understood then why she'd liked the train station. The ingenuity it took for some of that, well, it's just unreal. If the alchemists won't send me back to the US after this, I'm hoping I'll get assigned to Greece or Italy. That would be cool. "Yeah." Her smile faded. "But there are no guarantees you'll get what you want with this job." She fell silent after that, and I decided that coaxing her into this small conversation had been victory enough. I left her to her own thoughts of classic cars and architecture while my mind wandered to topics of my own. Strigoi. Duty. Dimitri. Always Dimitri. Well, Dimitri and Lissa. It was always a toss-up over who would cause me more pain. Today, as the car lulled me into a daze, it was Lissa I went to, thanks largely to Adrian's recent visit in my dream. Early evening in Russia meant early morning in Montana. Of course, since the school ran on a nocturnal schedule, it was technically night for them too in spite of the sunshine. It was nearly curfew, and everyone would have to return to their own dorms soon. Lissa was with Adrian, over in his room in guest housing. Adrian, like Avery, had graduated, but as the only other known spirit user, he'd come to stay indefinitely at the school and work with Lissa. They just spent a long, exhausting evening working on dream walking and sat on the floor facing each other. With a sigh, Lissa collapsed back and lay down, stretching her arms over her head. This is useless, she groaned. I'm never going to learn it. Never took you for a quitter, cousin. Adrian's voice was as flippant as usual, but I could tell he was weary too. They weren't really cousins, that was just a term royals sometimes used with each other. I just don't understand how you do it. I don't know how to explain it. I just think about it, and well, it happens. He shrugged and pulled out the cigarettes he always carried. Do you mind? Yes, she said. To my surprise, he put them away. What the hell? He'd never ask me if I minded if he smoked, which I did. In fact, half the time, I swore he did it to annoy me, which made no sense. Adrian was way past the age when guys tried to attract girls they liked by picking on them. He tried to explain the process. I just think about who I want and sort of. I don't know. Expand my mind toward them. Lissa sat up and crossed her legs. Sounds a lot like how Rose described reading me. Probably the same principle. Look, it took you a while to learn auras. This is no different. And you're not the only one with a learning curve. I'm only now finally moving past healing scratches, and you can bring back the dead, which call me crazy is kind of hardcore. He paused. Of course, some would argue that I am actually crazy. At the mention of auras, she studied him and summoned the ability to see the field of light that shone around every living thing. His aura came into focus, surrounding him in a golden glow. According to Adrian, her aura was the same. No other Maroi had that kind of pure gold. Lissa and Adrian figured it was unique to spirit users. He smiled, guessing what she was doing. How's it look? The same. See how good you are at it now? Just be patient with the dreams. Lissa wanted so badly to walk dreams the same way he could. Despite her disappointment, I was glad she couldn't. Adrian's dream visits were hard enough on me. Seeing her would, well, I wasn't entirely sure, but it would make this cool, hard attitude I was trying to maintain in Russia a lot harder. I just want to know how she is, said Lissa in a small voice. I can't stand not knowing. It was the conversation with Christian all over again. I saw her the other day. She's fine. And I'll go again soon. Lissa nodded. Do you think she'll do it? Do you think she can kill Dimitri? Adrian took a long time in answering. I think she can. The question will be if it kills her in the process. Lissa flinched, and I was a bit surprised. The answer was as blunt as one Christian might give. God, I wish she hadn't decided to go after him. Wishing's useless now. Rose has got to do this. It's the only way we can get her back. He paused. It's the only way she'll be able to move on. Adrian surprised me sometimes, but this took the prize. Lissa thought it was foolish and suicidal to go after Dimitri. I knew Sydney would agree if I told her the truth about this trip. But Adrian, silly, shallow, party boy Adrian understood. Studying him through Lissa's eyes, I realized he actually did. He didn't like it, and I could hear the hurt in his words. He cared about me. My having such strong feelings for someone else caused him pain. And yet, he truly believed that I was doing the right thing, the only thing I could do. Lissa looked at the clock. I've got to go before curfew. I should probably study for my history test, too. Adrian grinned. Studying's overrated. Just find someone smart to copy off. She stood up. Are you saying I'm not smart? Hell no. He rose also and went to pour himself a drink from the fully stocked bar he kept on hand. Self-medicating was his irresponsible way of keeping spirit's effects at bay, and if he'd been using spirit all night, he would want the numbness of his vices. You're the smartest person I know. but that doesn't mean you have to do unnecessary work. You can't succeed in life if you don't work. Copying from others won't get you anywhere. Whatever, he said with a grin. I copied all through school, and look how well I'm doing today. With an eye roll, Lissa gave him a quick hug goodbye and left. Once out of his sight, her smile faded a bit. In fact, her thoughts took a decidedly dark turn. Mentioning me had stirred up all sorts of feelings within. She was worried about me, desperately worried. She'd told Christian that she felt bad about what had happened between us, but the full force of that didn't hit me until now. She was racked by guilt and confusion, continually berating herself for what she should have done. And above all, she missed me. She had that same feeling I did, like a part of her had been cut out. Adrian lived on the 4th floor, and Lissa opted for the stairs rather than the elevator. All the while, her mind spun with worry. Worries about whether she'd ever master spirit. Worry for me. Worry that she wasn't currently feeling spirit's dark side effects, which made her wonder if I was absorbing them, just as a guardian named Anna had. She'd lived centuries ago and was bonded to Saint Vladimir, the school's namesake. She'd absorbed spirit's nasty effects from him and had been driven insane. On the 2nd floor, Lissa could make out the sounds of shouting, even through the door that separated the stairwell from the hallway. Despite knowing it had nothing to do with her, she hesitated, curiosity getting the best of her. A moment later, she quietly pushed the door open and stepped into the hall. The voices were coming from around the corner. She carefully peered around it, not that she needed to. She recognized the voices. Avery Lazar stood in the hallway, hands on her hips as she stared at her father. He stood in the doorway to what must have been his suite. Their stances were rigid and hostile, and anger crackled between them. "I'll do what I want," she yelled. "I'm not your slave." "You're my daughter," he said in a voice both calm and condescending. "Though at times I wish you weren't." Ouch. Both Lissa and I were shocked. "Then why are you making me stay in this hellhole? Let me go back to court. And embarrass me further? We barely got out without damaging this family's reputation much. No way am I going to send you there alone and let you do God knows what. Then send me to Mom. Switzerland's got to be better than this place." There was a pause. "Your mother is busy." "Oh, nice," said Avery, voice heavy with sarcasm. "That's a polite way of saying she doesn't want me. No surprise. I'd just interfere with her and that guy she's sleeping with." "Avery." His voice rang out loud and angry. Lissa flinched and stepped back. "This conversation is done. Get back to your room and sober up before someone sees you. I expect you at breakfast tomorrow, and I expect you to be respectable. We have some important visitors." "Yeah, and God knows we've got to keep up appearances." "Go to your room," he repeated. "Before I call Simon and make him drag you there." "Yes, sir," she simpered. "Right away, sir. Anything you say, sir." And with that, he slammed the door. Lissa, ducking back behind the corner, could hardly believe he'd said those things to his own daughter. For a few moments, there was silence. Then, Lissa heard the sound of footsteps coming toward her. Avery suddenly rounded the corner and stopped in front of Lissa, giving us our first good look of her. Avery was wearing a tight, short dress made of some kind of blue fabric that shone silvery in the light. Her hair hung long and wild, and the tears pouring from her blue-gray eyes had destroyed the heavy makeup she wore. The scent of alcohol came through loud and clear. She hastily ran a hand over her eyes, obviously embarrassed at being seen like this. "Well," she said flatly. "I guess you overheard our family drama." Lissa felt equally embarrassed at being caught spying. I am sorry. I didn't mean to. I was just passing by." Avery gave a harsh laugh. "Well, I don't think it matters. Probably everyone in the building heard us." "I'm sorry, Lissa repeated. Don't be. You didn't do anything wrong. No. I mean, I'm sorry he, said those things to you. It's part of being a good family. Everyone's got skeletons in their closet. Avery crossed her arms and leaned against the wall. Even upset and messy, she was beautiful. God, I hate him sometimes. No offense, but this place is so fucking boring. I found some sophomore guys to hang with tonight, but they were pretty boring too. The only thing they had going for them was their beer. Why did your dad bring you here? Lissa asked. Why aren't you? I don't know, in college. Avery gave a harsh laugh. He doesn't trust me enough. When we were at court, I got involved with this cute guy who worked there, total non-royal, of course. Dad freaked out and was afraid people would find out. So when he got the job here, he brought me along to keep an eye on me and torture me. I think he's afraid I'll run off with a human if I go to college. She sighed. I swear to God, if Reed wasn't here, I'd just run away, period. Lissa didn't say anything for a long time. She'd gone out of her way to avoid Avery diligently. With all the orders the Queen was giving Lissa lately, this seemed the only way Lissa could fight back and stop herself from being controlled. But now, she wondered if she'd been wrong about Avery. Avery didn't seem like a spy for Tatiana. She didn't seem like someone who wanted to mold Lissa into a perfect royal. Mostly, Avery seemed like a sad, hurting girl, whose life was spinning out of control. Someone who was being ordered around as much as Lissa was lately. With a deep breath, Lissa rushed forward with her next words. Do you want to eat lunch with Christian and me tomorrow? No one would mind if you came to our lunch period. I can't promise it'll be, as exciting as you want. Avery smiled again, but this time, it was less bitter. Well, my other plans were to get drunk by myself in my room. She lifted a bottle of what looked like whiskey out of her purse. Scored some stuff of my own. Lissa wasn't entirely sure what kind of an answer that was. So. I'll see you at lunch. Now Avery hesitated. But slowly, a faint gleam of hope and interest appeared on her face. Concentrating, Lissa tried to bring up her aura. She had a little difficulty at first, probably worn out from all the practice with Adrian tonight. But when she was finally able to get a grip on Avery's aura, she saw it was a mix of colors, green, blue, and gold. Not uncommon. It was currently ringed in red, as often happened when people were upset. But right before Lissa's eyes, that redness faded. Yeah, Avery said at last. That would be great. I think this is as far as we can go today. On the other side of the world, Sydney's voice startled me out of Lissa's thoughts. I didn't know how long I'd been daydreaming, but Sydney had turned off the main highway and was driving us into a small town that fit perfectly with my backwoods images of Siberia. In fact, town was a total exaggeration. There were a few scattered houses, a store, and a gas station. Farmland stretched beyond the buildings, and I saw more horses than cars. The few people who were out stared at our car in amazement. The sky had turned deep orange, and the sun was sinking farther and farther into the horizon. Sydney was right. It was nearly nightfall, and we needed to be off the road. We're only a couple hours away at most, she continued. We made really good time and should get there pretty quickly in the morning. She drove to the other side of the village, which took, a minute, and pulled up in front of a plain white house with a barn beside it. Here's where we're staying. We got out of the car and approached the house. Are these friends of yours? Nope. Never met them. But they're expecting us. More mysterious alchemist connections. The door was answered by a friendly-looking human in her 20s who urged us to come inside. She only spoke a few words of English, but Sydney's translation skills carried us through. Sydney was more outgoing and charming than I'd seen her thus far, probably because our hosts weren't despicable vampiric offspring. You wouldn't think riding in a car all day would be tiring, but I felt exhausted and was anxious to get an early start in the morning. So after dinner and a little TV, Sydney and I went to the room that had been prepared for us. It was small and plain but had 2 twin beds covered in thick, fluffy blankets. I snuggled into mine, grateful for the softness and the warmth, and wondered if I'd dream of Lissa or Adrian. I didn't. I did, however, wake up to a slight wave of nausea rolling through me, the nausea that told me there was a strigoi nearby. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 6. I bolted upright, every part of me awake and alert. There were no city lights to shine through the window, and it took me several seconds to make out anything in the darkened room. Sydney was curled up in her own bed, her face unusually at peace as she slept. Where was the strigoi? Definitely not in our room. Was it in the house? Everyone had said the road to Dimitri's town was dangerous. Still, I would have thought strigoi would be going after maroi and dompirs, though humans were a big part of their diet too. Thinking of the nice couple who'd welcomed us into their home, I felt something tight clench in my chest. No way would I let anything happen to them. Slipping quietly out of the bed, I grabbed the hold of my stake and crept from the room without disturbing Sydney. No one else was awake, and as soon as I was in the living room, the nausea went away. Okay. The strigoi wasn't inside, which was a good thing. It was outdoors, apparently on the side of the house near my room. Still moving silently, I went out the house's front door and walked around a corner, as quiet as the night around me. The nausea grew stronger as I approached the barn, and I couldn't help but feel smug. I was going to surprise the strigoi who thought it could sneak into a tiny human village for dinner. There, right near the barn's entrance, I could see a long shadow moving. Gotcha, I thought. I readied the stake and started to spring forward, and then something struck me on the shoulder. I stumbled, astonished, and looked into the face of a strigoi. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the shadow by the barn materialize into another strigoi striding forward. Panic shot through me. There were 2, and my secret detection system hadn't been able to tell the difference. Worse, they'd gotten the drop on me. A thought immediately flashed into my mind: what if one's Dimitri? It wasn't. At least, this close one wasn't. It was a woman. I had yet to get a feel for the second one. That one was approaching from my other side, moving fast. I had to deal with this immediate threat, though, and swipe at the woman with my stake, hoping to wound her, but she dodged so quickly, I hardly saw her move. She struck out toward me in an almost casual way. I wasn't fast enough to react and went flying toward the other strigoi, a guy who was not Dimitri. I responded quickly, leaping up and kicking him. I held the stake out, creating distance between us, but it did little good when the woman came up from behind and grabbed me, jerking my body against hers. I gave a muffled cry and felt her hands on my throat. She was probably going to break my neck, I realized. It was a fast, easy technique for strigoi that then let them drag off a victim for feeding. I struggled, jostling her hands slightly, but as the other strigoi leaned over us, I knew it was useless. They'd surprised me. There were 2 of them. They were strong. Panic surged in me again, an overwhelming sense of fear and desperation. I was afraid every time I fought strigoi, but this fear was reaching a breaking point. It was unfocused and out of control, and I suspected it was touched by a bit of the madness and darkness I'd absorbed from Lissa. The feelings exploded within me, and I wondered if they'd destroy me before the strigoi did. I was in very real danger of dying here, of letting Sydney and the others get killed. The rage and distress of that thought were smothering. Then, suddenly, it was like the earth burst open. Translucent forms, glowing softly in the darkness, sprang up everywhere. Some looked like normal people. Others were horrible, their faces gaunt and skull-like. Ghosts. Spirits. They surrounded us, their presence making my hair stand on end and sending a splitting headache through my skull. The ghosts turned toward me. I'd had this happen before, on a plane, when apparitions had swarmed and threatened to consume me. I braced myself, trying desperately to summon up the strength to build barriers that would shut me off from the spirit world. It was a skill I'd had to learn, one I usually kept in place without any effort. The desperation and panic of the situation had cracked my control. In that horrible, blood-curdling moment, I again selfishly wished Mason hadn't found peace and left this world. I would have felt better if his ghost were here. Then I realized I wasn't their target. The ghosts were mobbing the two strigoi. The spirits didn't have solid forms, but every place they touched and passed through me felt like ice. The female strigoi immediately began waving her arms to fend the apparitions off, snarling in rage and something almost like fear. The ghosts didn't appear to be able to hurt the strigoi, but they were apparently pretty annoying and distracting. I staked the male strigoi before he ever saw me coming. Immediately, the ghosts around him moved to the woman. She was good, I'd give her that. Despite struggling to fend the spirits off, she was still able to dodge my attacks fairly well. A lucky punch from her made stars burst before my eyes and sent me into the barn wall. I still had that ghost-induced splitting headache, and my head slamming into the barn didn't help. Staggering up, dizzy, I made my way back to her and continued my efforts to get a shot in at her heart. She managed to keep her chest out of my range at least until one particularly terrifying ghost caught her off guard. Her momentary distraction gave me my chance, and I staked her, too. She fell to the ground leaving me alone with the spirits. With the strigoi, the ghosts had clearly wanted to attack them. With me, it was a lot like on the plane. They seemed fascinated by me, desperate to get my attention. Only, with dozens of phantoms swarming, it might as well have been an attack. Desperately, I tried again to summon my walls, to block the ghosts off from me as I'd done long ago. The effort was excruciating. Somehow, my out-of-control emotions had brought the spirits, and while I was calmer now, that control was harder to bring about. My head continued throbbing. Gritting my teeth, I focused every ounce of my strength into blocking out the ghosts. "Go away," I hissed. "I don't need you anymore." For a moment, it looked like my efforts were going to be useless. Then, slowly, one by one, the spirits began to fade. I felt the control I'd learned before gradually slip into place. Soon, there was nothing there but me, the darkness, and the barn and Sydney. I noticed her just as I collapsed to the ground. She was running out of the house in her pajamas, face pale. Kneeling at my side, she helped me sit up, legitimate fear all over her. "Rose. Are you okay?" I felt like every scrap of energy in my brain and body had been sucked out. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. "No," I told her. And then I passed out. I dreamed of Dimitri again, his arms around me and beautiful face leaning over me to care for me as he'd done so often when I was sick. Memories of things past came to me, the two of us laughing over some joke. Sometimes, in these dreams, he'd carry me away. Sometimes, we'd be riding in a car. Occasionally, his face would start to take on that fearsome strigoi image that always tormented me. Then I'd quickly order my mind to brush such thoughts away. Dimitri had taken care of me so many times and had always been there when I needed him. It had gone both ways, though. Admittedly, he had not seemed to end up in the infirmary as much as me. That was just my luck. Even when he was injured, he wouldn't acknowledge it. And as I dreamed and hallucinated, images came to me of one of the few times I'd been able to take care of him. Just before the school had been attacked, Dimitri had been involved in a number of tests with me and my fellow novices to see how well we reacted to surprise assaults. Dimitri was so tough that he was almost impossible to beat, though he still got bruised up a number of times. I'd run into him in the gym once during these tests, surprised to see a cut on his cheek. It was hardly fatal, but there was a fair amount of blood showing. "Do you realize you're bleeding to death?" I'd exclaimed. It was kind of an exaggeration, but still. He touched his cheek absent-mindedly and seemed to notice the injury for the first time. "I wouldn't quite go that far. It's nothing. It's nothing until you get an infection." "You know that's not likely," he said obstinately. That was true. Maroi, aside from contracting the occasional rare disease, as Victor had hardly ever got sick. We Dompiers had inherited that from them, just as Sydney's tattoo gave her some protection. Nonetheless, I wasn't about to let Dimitri bleed all over. "Come on," I said, pointing to the small bathroom in the gym. My voice had been fierce, and to my surprise, he'd actually obeyed. After wetting a washcloth, I gently cleaned his face. He continued protesting at first but finally fell quiet. The bathroom was small, and we were just a few inches from each other. I could smell his clean, intoxicating scent and studied every detail of his face and strong body. My heart raced in my chest, but we were supposed to be on good behavior, so I tried to appear cool and collected. He was eerily calm too, but when I brushed his hair back behind his ears to clean the rest of his face, he flinched. My fingertips touching his skin had sent shockwaves through me, and he'd felt them too. He caught hold of my hand and pulled it away. "Enough," he said, voice husky. "I'm fine." "Are you sure?" I asked. He hadn't released my hand. We were so close. The small bathroom seemed ready to burst with the electricity building between us. I knew this couldn't last but hated to let go of him. God, it was hard being responsible sometimes. "Yes," he said. His voice was soft, and I knew he wasn't mad at me. He was afraid of how little it would take to ignite a fire between us. As it was, I was warm all over, just from the feel of his hand. Touching him made me feel complete, like the person I was always meant to be. "Thank you, Rosa." He released my hand, and we left, both off to do our own things that day. But the feel of his skin and hair stayed with me for hours afterward. I don't know why I dreamed that memory after being attacked near the barn. It seemed weird that I'd dream of taking care of Dimitri when I was the one who needed care. I guess it didn't really matter what the memory was, so long as it involved him. Dimitri always made me feel better, even in my dreams, giving me strength and resolve. But as I lay in that delirium and moved in and out of consciousness, his comforting face would occasionally take on those terrible red eyes and fangs. I'd whimper, fighting hard to push that sight away. Other times, he didn't look like Dimitri at all. He'd turn into a man I didn't know, an older Maroi with dark hair and cunning eyes, gold jewelry glinting on his neck and ears. I'd cry out for Dimitri again, and eventually, his face would return, safe and wonderful. At one point, though, the image shifted again, this time into a woman's. Clearly, she wasn't Dimitri, but there was something about her brown eyes that reminded me of him. She was older, in her 40s maybe, and a Domper. She laid a cool cloth across my forehead, and I realized I wasn't dreaming anymore. My body ached, and I was in an unfamiliar bed, in an unfamiliar room. No sign of the strigoi. Had I dreamed them, too? "Don't try to move," the woman said with the faintest trace of a Russian accent. "You took some bad hits." My eyes widened as the events by the barn came back to me, the ghosts I'd summoned up. It hadn't been a dream. "Where's Sydney? Is she okay?" "She's fine. Don't worry." Something in the woman's voice told me I could believe her. "Where am I?" "In Bea. Bea, Bea." Somewhere, in the back of my head, that name was familiar. All of a sudden, it clicked. Long ago, Dimitri had said it. He'd only ever mentioned his town's name once and, even though I'd tried, I had never been able to remember it. Sydney would never tell me the name. But now we were here. Dimitri's home. Who are you? I asked. Olena, she said. Olena Belikova. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 7. It was like Christmas morning. I wasn't usually big on God or fate, but now I was seriously reconsidering. After I'd passed out, Sydney had apparently made some frantic calls, and someone she knew in Baya had driven to us, risking the darkness to rescue us and take us back where I could be treated. That was no doubt why I'd had vague sensations of being in a car during my delirium. It hadn't all been part of the dream. And then, somehow, out of all the Dompirs in Baya, I had been taken to Dimitri's mother. That was enough to make me seriously consider that there might truly be forces greater than me at work in the universe. No one told me exactly how it happened, but I soon learned Olena Belikova had a reputation among her peers for healing, and not even any sort of magical healing. She'd had medical training and was the person other Dompirs and even some Maroi went to in this region when they wanted to avoid human attention. Still, the coincidence was eerie, and I couldn't help but think there was something going on that I didn't understand. For now, I didn't worry too much about the hows and whys of my current situation. I was too busy staring wide-eyed at my surroundings and its inhabitants. Olena didn't live alone. All of Dimitri's sisters, 3 of them, lived in the house too, along with their kids. The family resemblance was startling. None of them looked exactly like Dimitri, but in every face, I could see him. The eyes. The smile. Even the sense of humor. Seeing them fed the Dimitri withdrawal I'd had since he'd disappeared and made it worse at the same time. Whenever I looked at any of them out of my peripheral vision, I'd think I was seeing Dimitri. It was like a house of mirrors, with distorted reflections of him everywhere. Even the house gave me a thrill. There were no obvious signs that Dimitri had ever lived there, but I kept thinking, this is where he grew up. He walked these floors, touched these walls. As I walked from room to room, I'd touch the walls too, trying to draw his energy from them. I'd envision him lounging on the couch, home on break from school. I wondered if he'd slid down the banisters when he was little. The images were so real that I had to keep reminding myself that he hadn't been here in ages. "You've made an amazing recovery," Olena noted the next morning after I'd been brought to her. She watched with approval as I inhaled a plate of blini. They were ultra-thin pancakes stacked and layered with butter and jam. My body always required a lot of food to keep its strength up, and I figured as long as I wasn't chewing with my mouth open or anything, I had no reason to feel bad about eating so much. "I thought you were dead when Abe and Sydney brought you in." "Ooh?" I asked between bites of food. Sydney sat at the table with the rest of the family, hardly touching her food as usual. She seemed clearly uneasy at being in a Domper household, but when I'd first come downstairs this morning, I'd definitely seen some relief in her eyes. "Abe Mazur," said Sydney. Unless I was mistaken, some of the other people at the table exchanged knowing glances. "He's a Maroi." I didn't know how badly you were injured last night, so I called him. He drove down with his guardians. He was the one who brought you here." "Guardians. Plural. Is he royal?" Mazur wasn't a royal name, but that wasn't always a sure sign of someone's lineage. And while I was beginning to trust Sydney's social networking and connections to powerful people, I couldn't imagine why a royal would go out of his way for me. Maybe he owed the alchemists a favor. "No," she said bluntly. I frowned. A non-royal Maroi with more than one guardian? Very odd. It was clear she wasn't going to say anything else on the matter, at least not for now. I swallowed another mouthful of blini and turned my attention back to Olena. "Thanks for taking me in." Dimitri's older sister, Carolina, sat at the table too, along with her baby girl and son Paul. Paul was about 10 and seemed fascinated by me. Dimitri's teenage sister, Victoria, was also there. She appeared to be a little younger than me. The third Belikov sister was named Sonia and had left for work before I woke up. I'd have to wait to meet her. Did you really kill 2 strigoi all by yourself? Paul asked me. Paul, chastised Carolina. That's not a nice question to ask. But it's an exciting one, said Victoria with a grin. Her brown hair was streaked with gold, but her dark eyes sparkled so much like Dimitri's when he was excited that it tugged at my heart. Again, I had that taunting sensation of Dimitri being here but not here. She did, said Sydney. I saw the bodies. Like always. She wore that comically tormented expression of hers, and I laughed. At least I left them where you could find them this time. My humor suddenly dimmed. Did anyone, any other humans notice or hear? I got rid of the bodies before anyone saw, she said. If people heard anything. Well, backwoods places like that are always filled with superstitions and ghost stories. They don't have factual evidence of vampires, per se, but there's always sort of this belief that the supernatural and dangerous are out there. Little do they know. She said ghost stories without any change of expression. I wondered if she'd seen any of the spirits last night but finally decided she probably hadn't. She'd come outside near the tail end of the fight, and if past evidence was any indication, nobody else could see the spirits I saw except Strigoi, as it turned out. You must have had some good training then, said Carolina, shifting so the baby leaned against her shoulder. You look like you should still be in school. Just got out, I said, earning another scrutinizing look from Sydney. You're American, said Olena matter-of-factly. What in the world could bring you out here? I'm looking for someone, I said after a few moments' hesitation. I was afraid they were going to press for details or that she too would have blood-whore suspicions, but just then, the kitchen door opened and Dimitri's grandmother, Yeva, walked in. She had poked her head in earlier and scared the hell out of me. Dimitri had told me that she was a witch of sorts, and I could believe it. She looked like she was a gazillion years old and was so thin, it was a wonder the wind didn't blow her away. She barely stood 5 feet tall, and her hair covered her head in patchy gray wisps. But it was her eyes that truly frightened me. The rest of her might be frail, but those dark eyes were sharp and alert and seemed to bore into my soul. Even without Dimitri's explanation, I would have taken her for a witch. She was also the only one in the household who didn't speak English. She sat down at one of the empty chairs, and Olena hastily jumped up to get some more blinny. Yeva muttered something in Russian that made the others look uncomfortable. Sydney's lips twitched into a small smile. Yeva's eyes were on me as she spoke, and I glanced around for translation. What? I asked. Grandmother says you're not telling us the whole truth about why you're here. She says the longer you delay, the worse it will be, Victoria explained. She then gave Sydney an apologetic look. And she wants to know when the alchemist is leaving. As soon as possible, said Sydney dryly. Well, why I'm here, it's kind of a long story. Could I be any vaguer? Yeva said something else, and Olena retorted with what sounded like a chastisement. To me, she spoke gently, ignore her, Rose. She's in one of her moods. Why you're here is your own business, although I'm sure Abe would like to talk to you at some point. She frowned slightly, and I was reminded of the earlier looks at the table. You should make sure you thank him. He seemed very concerned about you. I'd kind of like to see him too, I mumbled, still curious about this well-protected, non-royal Maroi who had given me a ride and seemed to make everyone uneasy. Eager to avoid more talk of why I was here, I hastily changed the subject. I'd also love to look around Bea. I've never been in a place like this before where so many Dompiers live, I mean. Victoria brightened. I can definitely give you a tour if you're sure you're feeling okay. Or if you don't have to leave right away. She believed I was passing through, which was just as well. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I was doing anymore, now that it seemed likely Dimitri wasn't in the area. I glanced at Sydney questioningly. She shrugged. Do whatever you want. I'm not going anywhere. I found that a little disconcerting too. She'd brought me here as her superiors had told her to do, but now what? Well, that was a concern for later. As soon as I finished my food, Victoria practically dragged me out the door, as if I was the most exciting thing that had happened around here in a while. Yeva hadn't taken her eyes off me for the rest of the meal, and even though she'd never said anything else, her suspicious look clearly told me she didn't believe a word I'd said. I invited Sydney along on the outing, but she declined, choosing instead to lock herself away in a bedroom to read about Greek temples or make world-controlling phone calls or do whatever it was she did. Victoria said downtown wasn't far from where they lived and was easy to walk to. The day was clear and cool, with enough sun to make being outside pretty pleasant. We don't get a lot of visitors, she explained. Except for Maroi men, but most don't stay long. She added no more, but I wondered about her implications. Were these Maroi men off to find some action with Domper women? I'd grown up thinking of these women, Dompiers who chose not to become guardians, as disgraceful and dirty. The ones in the Nightingale had certainly met the blood horse stereotype, but Dimitri had assured me that not all Domper women were like that. After meeting the Belikovs, I believed him. As we approached the center of town, I soon discovered another myth shattered. People always talked about blood whores living in camps or communes, but that wasn't the case here. Baya wasn't huge, not like St. Petersburg or even Omsk, but it was a real town with a large human population. Hardly a rural camp or farm settlement. The whole setting was astonishingly normal, and when we reached downtown, lined with small shops and restaurants, it too seemed like any other place in the world people might live. Modern and ordinary, just with a slight village feel. Where are all the Dompiers? I wondered aloud. Sydney had said there was a secret Domper subculture, but I saw no signs of it. Victoria smiled. Oh, they're here. We have a lot of businesses and other places that humans don't know about. While I could understand Dompiers going unnoticed in big cities, it seemed remarkable to pull that off here. And lots of us just live and work with humans. She nodded over toward what looked like a drugstore. That's where Sonia works now. Now that she's pregnant. Victoria rolled her eyes. I'd take you to meet her, but she's grumpy all the time lately. I hope the baby's early. She left it at that, and I again wondered about the dynamics of Dompiers and Maroi here. We didn't mention it again, and our conversation stayed light and even teasing. Victoria was easy to like, and in only an hour, we'd clicked as though we'd known each other forever. Maybe my connection to Dimitri bound me to his family, too. My thoughts were cut off when someone called Victoria's name. We turned to see a very cute Domper guy crossing the street. He had bronze hair and dark eyes, his age falling somewhere between mine and Victoria's. He said something chatty and conversational to her. She grinned at him and then gestured to me, giving my introduction in Russian. This is Nikolai, she told me in English. Nice to meet you, he said, also switching languages. He gave me a quick assessment in the way guys often do, but when he turned back to Victoria, it was clear who the object of his affections was. You should bring Rose to Marina's party. It's Sunday night. He hesitated, turning a bit shy. You're going, aren't you? Victoria turned thoughtful, and I realized she was completely oblivious to his crush. I'll be there, but... She turned to me. Will you still be around? I don't know, I said honestly. But I'll go if I'm still here. What kind of party is it? Marina's a friend from school, explained Victoria. We're just going to get together and celebrate before we go back. To school? I asked stupidly. Somehow, it had never occurred to me that the Dompiers out here would be in school. We're on break right now, said Nikolai. For Easter? Oh. It was late April, but I had no clue what day Easter fell on this year. I'd lost track of the days. It hadn't happened yet, so their school must have their break the week before Easter. St. Vladimir's took its vacation afterward. Where is your school? It's about 3 hours away. Even more remote than here. Victoria made a face. Bay is not so bad, teased Nikolai. Easy for you to say. You'll eventually leave and go see new and exciting places. Can't you? I asked her. She frowned, suddenly uncomfortable. Well, I could, but that's not how we do it here, at least not in my family. Grandmother has some strong opinions about men and women. Nikolai will be a guardian, but I'll stay here with my family. Nikolai suddenly gave me a new appraisal. Are you a guardian? Ah, well. Now I was the uncomfortable one. Victoria spoke before I could come up with anything to say. She killed 2 strigoi outside of town. By herself. He looked impressed. You are a guardian? Well, no. I've killed before, but I'm not actually sworn. Turning around, I lifted up my hair to show them my neck. In addition to all my regular Malnija marks, I also had the little star-shaped tattoo that meant I'd been in a battle. They both gasped, and Nikolai said something in Russian. I let my hair drop and looked back. What? You're... Victoria bit her lip, eyes contemplative as she groped for what she wanted to say. Unpromised? I don't know the English word. Unpromised. I said. I guess, but technically, aren't all the women here? Even if we aren't guardians, we still get marks showing we completed our training. No promise mark, though. For you to have killed so many strigoi and have no loyalties to a school or the guardians. Victoria shrugged. We call it being unpromised. It's a strange thing. It's strange where I come from too, I admitted. Unheard of, really. So much so, that we didn't have a term for it. It just wasn't done. I should let you two go, said Nikolai, his lovesick eyes back on Victoria. But I'll see you at Marina's for sure? Maybe sooner. Yes, she agreed. They said their farewells in Russian, and then he loped off across the street with the kind of easy, athletic grace guardians often acquired with training. It reminded me a bit of Dimitri's. I must have scared him off, I said. No, he thinks you're exciting. Not as exciting as he thinks you are. Her eyebrows rose. What? He likes you. I mean, really likes. Can't you tell? Oh. We're just friends. I could tell from her attitude that she meant it. She was completely indifferent to him, which was too bad. He was cute and nice. Letting poor Nikolai go, I brought up the guardians again. I was intrigued by the different attitudes around here. You said you can't, but do you want to be a guardian? She hesitated. I've never really considered it. I get all the same training at school, and I like being able to defend myself. But I'd rather use it in defense of my family than Maroi. I guess it sounds. She paused again to think of the right word. Sexist. But, the men become guardians, and women stay at home. Only my brother left. I nearly tripped. Your brother? I asked, keeping my voice as steady as possible. Dimitri, she said. He's older than me and has been a guardian for a while. He's over in the United States, actually. We haven't seen him in a long time. Huh. I felt horrible and guilty. Guilty because I was keeping the truth from Victoria and the others. Horrible because apparently no one from back home had bothered to pass the news on to his family yet. Smiling at her own memories, she didn't notice my change in mood. Paul actually looks exactly like he did at that age. I should show you pictures of him and some recent ones, too. Dimitri's pretty cute. For my brother, I mean. I was sure seeing pictures of Dimitri as a little boy would rip my heart out. As it was, the more Victoria began to talk about him, the sicker I felt. She had no clue about what had happened, and even though it had been a couple of years since she'd seen him, it was clear she and the rest of the family loved him like crazy. Not that that should be a surprise. And really, who couldn't love Dimitri? Being around them just one morning had shown me how close they all were. I knew from Dimitri's stories that he was crazy about all of them, too. Rose? Are you okay? Victoria was peering at me with concern, probably because I hadn't said anything in the last 10 minutes. We had circled around and were almost back at her house. Looking at her open, friendly face and eyes that were so much like Dimitri's, I realized I had another task ahead of me before I could go after Dimitri, wherever he was. I swallowed. Yeah. I think I need to sit down with you and the rest of your family. Okay, she said, the worry still in her voice. Inside the house, Olena was bustling around the kitchen with Carolina. I thought they were making plans for tonight's dinner, which was startling considering we'd just finished a huge breakfast. I could definitely get used to the way they ate around here. In the living room, Paul was building an elaborate racetrack out of Legos. Yeva sat in a rocking chair and appeared to be the world's most stereotypical grandmother as she knit a pair of socks. Except most grandmothers didn't look like they could incinerate you with a single glance. Olena was talking to Carolina in Russian but switched to English when she saw me. You two are back earlier than I expected. We saw the town, said Victoria. And Rose wanted to talk to you. To all of us. Olena gave me a look as puzzled and concerned as Victoria's. What's going on? The weight of all those Belikov eyes on me made my heart start thumping in my chest. How was I going to do this? How could I explain something I hadn't spoken about in weeks? I couldn't stand to put them or myself through it. When Yeva scuttled in, it made things that much worse. Maybe she'd had some mystical sense that something big was about to go down. We should sit, I said. Paul stayed in the living room, for which I was grateful. I was pretty sure I couldn't handle saying what I had to with a little kid one who looked like Dimitri, apparently watching me. Rose, what's wrong? Asked Olena. She looked so sweet and, well, motherly, that I nearly cried. Whenever I'd been angry with my own mother for not being around or doing a good job, I'd always compared her to some idealized image of a mom who seemed a lot like Dimitri's, I realized. Dimitri's sisters looked equally worried, like I was someone they'd known forever. That acceptance and concern made my eyes burn even more, seeing as they just met me this morning. Yeva wore a very strange expression, however, almost like she'd been expecting something like this all along. Well, the thing is, the reason I came here, to Bea, was to find you guys. That wasn't entirely true. I'd come to search for Dimitri. I'd never thought much about finding his family, but now, I realized that it was a good thing I had. You see, Victoria was talking about Dimitri earlier. Olena's face brightened when I said her son's name. And I knew know him. He used to be a guardian at my school. My teacher, actually. Carolina and Victoria lit up as well. How is he? Asked Carolina. It's been ages since we've seen him. Do you know when he's going to visit? I couldn't even think about answering her question, so I pushed forward with my story before I lost my courage in front of all those loving faces. As the words came out of my mouth, it was almost like someone else was saying them and I was simply watching from a distance. A month ago, our school was attacked by strigoi. A really bad attack, a huge group of strigoi. We lost a lot of people, Maroi and Dompiers, both. Olena exclaimed in Russia. Victoria leaned toward me. Saint Vladimir's. I halted in my story, surprised. You've heard of it? Everyone's heard of it, said Carolina. We all know what happened. That was your school? You were there that night? I nodded. No wonder you have so many Malnija marks, breathed Victoria in wonder. And that's where Dimitri's at now, asked Olena. We lost track of his latest assignment.
Yeah.
My tongue felt thick in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I was at the school the night of the attack, I reaffirmed. And so was Dimitri. He was one of the leaders in the battle, and the way he fought, he was so brave, and. My words were breaking up, but by this point, the others were catching on. Olena gasped and again murmured in Russian. I picked out the word for God. Carolina sat frozen, but Victoria leaned toward me. Those eyes that were so like her brother's stared at me intently as he would if pushing me to tell the truth, no matter how awful. What happened? She demanded. What happened to Dimitri? I looked away from their faces, my eyes drifting to the living room. On the far wall, I caught sight of a bookcase filled with old, leather-covered books. They had gold-embossed lettering on the spines. It was totally random, but I suddenly remembered Dimitri mentioning those. They were these old adventure novels my mother collected, he'd told me once. The covers were so beautiful, and I loved them. If I was careful, she'd let me read them sometimes. The thought of a young Dimitri sitting in front of that bookcase, carefully turning the pages and he would have been careful almost made me lose it. Had that been where he'd developed his love of Western novels? I was losing it. I was getting distracted. I wasn't going to be able to tell them the truth. My emotions were growing too powerful, my memories flooding me as I fought to think about anything that didn't involve that horrible battle. Then I glanced at Yeva again, and something about her eerie, knowing expression inexplicably spurred me on. I had to do this. I turned back to the others. He fought really bravely in the battle, and afterward, he helped lead a rescue mission to save some people that the strigoi had captured. He was really amazing there, too, only, I stopped again and realized tears were running down my cheeks. In my mind, I was replaying that awful scene in the cave, with Dimitri so close to freedom and taken by a strigoi at the last minute. Shaking that thought away, I took another deep breath. I had to finish this. I owed it to his family. There was no gentle way to say it. One of the strigoi there, well, he overpowered Dimitri. Carolina buried her face in her mother's shoulder, and Olena made no effort to hide her own tears. Victoria wasn't crying, but her face had gone perfectly still. She was working hard to keep her emotions in check, just as Dimitri would have. She searched my face, needing to know for sure. Dimitri is dead, she said. It was a statement, not a question, but she was looking to me for confirmation. I wondered if I'd given away something, some hint that there was still more to the story. Or maybe she just needed the certainty of those words. And for a moment, I considered telling them that Dimitri was dead. It was what the Academy would tell them, what the Guardians would tell them. It would be easier on them, but somehow, I couldn't stand to lie to them even if it was a comforting lie. Dimitri would have wanted the whole truth, and his family would too. No, I said, and for a heartbeat, hope sprang up in everyone's faces at least until I spoke again. Dimitri's a strigoi. Vampire Academy 4, Blood Promise Chapter 8. The reactions were mixed among Dimitri's family members. Some cried. Some were stunned. And some, mainly Yeva and Victoria, simply took it in and kept their emotions from their faces, just as Dimitri would have done. That upset me almost as much as the tears, it reminded me too much of him. Out of all of them, pregnant Sonia, who came home shortly after the news broke, had the most intense physical reaction. She ran sobbing to her room and wouldn't come out. It didn't take long, however, for Yeva and Olena to spring into action. They spoke rapidly in Russian, clearly planning something. Phone calls were made, and Victoria was dispatched to run an errand. No one seemed to need me, so I mostly wandered the house and tried to stay out of the way. I found myself studying the shelves I'd seen earlier, running my hands along the leather-bound books. The titles were in Cyrillic, but it didn't matter. Touching them and imagining Dimitri having held and read them somehow made me feel closer to him. Looking for a little light reading. Sydney walked up and stood beside me. She hadn't been around earlier but had heard the news. Very light, seeing as I don't understand any of them, I replied. I gestured to the scurrying family members. What's going on here? They're planning Dimitri's funeral, Sydney explained. Or, well, his memorial service. I frowned. But he's not dead, shh. She cut me off with a sharp gesture and glanced warily at the others as they hustled around. Don't say that. But it's true, I hissed back. She shook her head. Not to them. Out here, out in these villages, there's no in-between state. You're alive or you're dead. They aren't going to acknowledge him being one of those. She couldn't keep the disgust out of her voice. For all intents and purposes, he is dead to them. They'll mourn him and move on. So should you. I didn't take offense at her blunt attitude because I knew she hadn't meant to give any. It was just her way. The problem was, that in-between state was very real to me, and there was no way I could move on. Not yet. Rose. Began Sydney after several seconds of silence. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I'm sorry. You mean, for Dimitri? Yet. I had no idea. I haven't really been that nice to you. I mean, I'm not going to act like I feel any better about hanging out with your kind, but you guys are still, well, not human, obviously. But I don't know. You still have feelings, you still love and hurt. And while we were coming here, you had all this horrible news in you, and I didn't make it any easier for you. So I'm sorry for that. And I'm sorry for thinking the worst of you. At first, I thought she was talking about thinking I was evil, but then I got it. She'd thought this whole time that I really was coming to be a blood whore and now believed delivering the news to Dimitri's family had been my only purpose. I didn't bother to correct her. Thanks, but you couldn't have known. And honestly, if I were in your place, I don't know. I'd probably act the same way. No, she said. You wouldn't. You're always nice to people. I gave her an incredulous look. Have you been traveling with someone else these last few days? Back home, I've got a reputation for not always being so nice. I've got attitude, and I know it. She smiled. Yeah, you do. But you also say the right things to people when you have to. Telling the Belikovs what you did, well, that was hard. And no matter what you say, you can be polite and go out of your way to make people feel good. Most of the time. I was a bit startled. Was that how I appeared? I often thought of myself as a trigger-happy queen bitch and tried to think about my behavior with her these last few days. I had sparred with her a lot, but among the others we'd met, I supposed I had been friendly. Well, thanks, I said, not knowing what else to say. Did you see Abe yet? When you walked around town? No, I said, realizing I'd forgotten about my mysterious rescuer. Should I have? I just figured he'd find you. Who is he? Why did he come get us when you told him I was hurt? Sydney hesitated, and I thought I was going to get some more of the alchemist's silent treatment. Then, after glancing around uneasily, she said in a low voice, Abe's not royal, but he's a really important guy. He's not Russian either, but he's in the country a lot, always on business both illegal and legal, I think. He's friends with all the important Maroi, and half the time, it seems like he controls the alchemists, too. I know he's involved in the process of making our tattoos, but his business goes far beyond that. We have a name for him behind his back. Zime. Zima what? I had barely heard the word. It sounded like Zime. It was certainly nothing I'd ever heard before. She gave a small smile at my confusion. Zime is Russian for snake. But not just any snake. Her eyes narrowed as she pondered a better explanation. It's a term used in lots of myths. Sometimes for giant snakes heroes have to battle. There are also a few stories about wizards with snake blood who get called that. The snake in the Garden of Eden? Who made Eve fall? He was called a Zime too. I shivered. Okay, that was pretty freaky, but it made something click into place. The alchemists allegedly had ties to leaders and authorities, and Abe apparently wielded a lot of influence with them. Is Abe the one who wanted you to come with me to Bea? The reason the alchemists made you come here? Again, she paused, then nodded. Yeah, when I called that night in St. Petersburg, I was told there was a search going on for you. Abe gave orders through the alchemists for me to stay with you until he could meet up with us here. He's apparently been searching for you on someone's behalf. I went cold. My fears were being realized. People had been looking for me. But who? If Lissa had initiated a manhunt, I would have sensed it when I visited her mind. I didn't think it was Adrian either, not from the way he seemed so desperate and clueless about my whereabouts. Plus, he seemed to accept my need for this quest. So who was looking for me? And for what reason? This Abe sounded like a high-ranking person, albeit someone involved in shady business, someone who might very well be connected to the Queen or others almost as important. Had he been ordered to find me and bring me back? Or considering how much the Queen hated me, had he perhaps been ordered to make sure I didn't come back? Was I dealing with an assassin? Sydney certainly seemed to regard him with a weird mix of fear and respect. Maybe I don't want to meet him, I said. I don't think he'll hurt you. I mean, if he wanted to, he already would have. But be careful. He's always playing several games at once, and he deals in enough secrets to rival the alchemists. So you don't trust him? She gave me a rueful grin as she turned to walk away. You forget, I don't trust any of you. When she was gone, I decided to go outside, away from the sorrow and business indoors. I sat down on the top step of the backyard porch, watching Paul play. He was building a fort for some of his action figures. While sensitive to the grief in his family, it was hard for him to be too affected by the death of an uncle he'd only met a couple of times. The news didn't mean as much to him as it did to the rest of us. With so much time on my hands for the rest of the day, I decided to do a quick check-in with Lissa. In spite of myself, I was kind of curious about how things had panned out with Avery Lazar. While Lissa's intentions were good, she'd still had some misgivings about bringing Avery along to lunch. And yet, she was pleasantly surprised to see Avery fitting in perfectly, charming both Adrian and Christian. Admittedly, Adrian was impressed by pretty much anything female. Christian was harder to crack, but even he seemed to be growing fond of her, probably because she kept teasing Adrian. Anyone who could make a joke at Adrian's expense ranked high on Christian's list. So, explain this, Avery said, winding linguine around her fork. You just, hang around the academy all day? Are you trying to redo your high school experience? Nothing to redo, said Adrian loftily. I totally ruled my high school. I was worshipped and adored, not that that should come as a shock. Beside him, Christian nearly choked on his food. So, you're trying to relive your glory days. It's all gone downhill since then, huh? No way, said Adrian. I'm like a fine wine. I get better with age. The best is yet to come. Seems like it get old after a while, said Avery, apparently not convinced by the compelling wine simile. I'm certainly bored, and I even spend part of the day helping my dad. Adrian sleeps most of the day, noted Lissa, trying to keep a straight face. So he doesn't actually have to worry about finding things to do. Hey, I spend a good portion of my time helping you unravel the mysteries of spirit, Adrian reminded her. Avery leaned forward, curiosity all over her pretty face. So it's actually real? I heard stories about spirit, about how you can heal people. It took Lissa a moment to respond. She wasn't sure she'd ever get used to her magic being out in the open now. Among other things. We're still figuring it out. Adrian was more eager than she was to discuss it, probably in the hopes of impressing Avery, and provided a quick rundown of some of Spirit's abilities, like auras, and compulsion. And, he added, I can visit people in their dreams. Christian held up a hand. Stop. I can feel there's a comment coming on about how women already dream about you. I just ate, you know. I wasn't going to go there, said Adrian. But he kind of looked like he wished he'd thought of the joke first. I couldn't help being a little amused. Adrian was so brash and flippant in public, and then, in my dreams, he'd show that serious and concerned side. He was more complex than anyone gave him credit for. Avery looked floored. Man. I used to think using air was cool. I guess not. A small breeze suddenly blew her hair back, making her look as though she were posing for a swimsuit photo shoot. She gave the group a dazzling smile. All that was missing was a photographer. The sound of the bell made them all stand up. Christian realized he'd left homework in another class and hurried off to get it after kissing Lissa goodbye, of course. Adrian departed equally as fast. The teachers start giving me dirty looks if I hang around once classes start. He gave Lissa and Avery a small half bow. Until next time, ladies. Avery, who couldn't care less about what teachers thought, walked with Lissa to her next class. The older girl's face was thoughtful. So, you really are with Christian, right? Was she ever? If Avery'd seen half the things I'd seen Christian and Lissa do through the bond, there'd be no question. Lissa laughed. Yes, why? Avery hesitated, piquing Lissa's curiosity. Well, I heard that you were involved with Adrian. Lissa nearly stopped walking. Where did you hear that? At court. The Queen was saying how happy she is about you guys being a couple and how you're always together. Lissa groaned. That's because whenever I go to court, she invites him too and then sends us both off to do things for her. It's not by choice. Well, I mean, don't get me wrong. I don't mind spending time with him, but the reason we're always together there is because Tatiana makes us. She seems to like you, though. She talks about you all the time, about how much potential you have and how proud she is of you. I think she's proud to manipulate me. Going there is such a pain. She either completely ignores the fact that I'm dating Christian or takes whatever chance she can get to slip in insults about him. Queen Tatiana, like so many other people, could never forgive Christian's parents for willingly turning strigoi. Sorry, said Avery, looking like she felt really bad. I didn't mean to bring up a bad subject. I just kind of wanted to know if Adrian was available, that's all. Lissa wasn't mad at Avery. Her fury was turned toward the Queen, at how she assumed everyone would behave the way she wanted and dance when she commanded it. The Maroi world had been ruled by a king or a queen since the beginning of time, and sometimes, Lissa thought it was time for a change. They needed a system where everyone had an equal say, royal and non-royal alike. Even the Dompiers. The more she thought about it, the more she felt her temper spike, anger and frustration flaring up in a way more common to me than her. It made her want to scream sometimes, to walk right up to Tatiana and tell her their deal was off. No college was worth this. Maybe she'd even tell Tatiana that it was time for a revolution, time to overturn the Marois backward. Lissa blinked, astonished to find she was shaking. Where had that emotion come from? It was one thing to be upset with Tatiana, but this? She hadn't had such out-of-control rages since she first began using spirit. With a deep breath, she tried to use some of the calming techniques she'd acquired so that Avery wouldn't know what a nutcase she'd nearly turned into. I just hate people talking about me, that's all, Lissa said at last. Avery hadn't seemed to notice Lissa's lapse into anger. Well, if it makes you feel better, not everyone thinks that about you. I met a girl. Mia. Yeah, that was her name. Some non-royal. Avery's dismissive tone suggested she held the view a lot of royals had toward common Maroi. She just laughed about you and Adrian being together. Said it was ridiculous. Lissa almost smiled at that. Mia had once been Lissa's rival and a self-centered brat. But after Strigoi killed her mother, Mia had taken on a fierce, determined attitude, one both Lissa and I liked immensely. Mia lived at court with her father, secretly training to fight so that she would be able to battle Strigoi someday. Oh, said Avery suddenly. There's Simon. I should go. Lissa looked across the hall and saw Avery's stern guardian. Simon might not be as grim as Avery's brother Reed, but he still had that same stiff and dour look he'd had when Lissa first met him. Avery seemed to get along with him fine, though. Okay, said Lissa. I'll see you later. You bet, said Avery, starting to turn. Oh, and Avery. Avery glanced at Lissa. Yeah. Adrian is available. Avery's only answer was a quick grin before she headed off to join Simon. Back with the Belikovs in Bea, the memorial service was going forward. Neighbors and friends, all Dompiers, slowly arrived, many bringing food. It was my first glimpse of the Domper community, though it still didn't seem as mysterious as Sydney had implied. The kitchen turned into a banquet hall, with every counter and table